Somebody's auntie could walk into a corner store with $4 and come back with enough to feed a household for 2 days. No cookbook, no measuring cup, just a cast iron skillet that never cooled down and a memory that went back 3 generations. Number 41 on this list fed a family of 6 on one ingredient most people throw away. Number 19 showed up at every funeral repast from the Delta to Detroit. And number 7 kept children full through winters when the gas bill went unpaid. These were not recipes, they were survival systems built by Black women who turned nothing into something and never wrote a word of it down. Hit subscribe so you do not miss a single one. These are 100 forgotten poor man meals Black families ate to survive. Number 12, sweet potato pone. This was the dessert of people who could not afford sugar or flour. Sweet potatoes grated, mixed with molasses and a pinch of cinnamon, spread in a greased pan and baked until the top turned dark and caramelized. Dense, sticky, and deeply satisfying. Enslaved families made sweet potato pone because sweet potatoes were one of the few crops they could grow in their garden plots. After emancipation, women baked the pone in covered cast iron skillets set near a fire. By the 1950s, sweet potato pie had overtaken it in popularity and the older recipe faded. But the women who made it remembered the taste the way you remember your grandmother's hands. Dense and dark and honest, a dessert that asked for nothing you did not already have in the ground behind your house. Neck bone and rice transformed discarded pork bones into a meal of surprising richness and depth. Butchers sold neck bones for almost nothing because the meat was sparse and bones were considered waste by those who could afford better cuts. Black cooks knew that slow simmering would coax every bit of flavor from these bones, creating broth that turned plain rice into something deeply satisfying. The neck bones were browned first, then covered with water and simmered for hours with onions and garlic. The small bits of meat clinging to bones became tender enough to fall away, while marrow enriched the cooking liquid into something approaching gravy. Rice was cooked directly in this flavorful broth, absorbing every bit of pork essence. Families gathered around bowls, picking bones clean and savoring every morsel. Number 22, hard-boiled eggs in a brown paper twist. Eggs were the cheapest portable protein a Black household could send a working man out the door with, and porters carried them by the half dozen, twisted into a square of brown grocer's paper. By 1931, a dozen eggs at a Southside market ran around 28 cents, just over 2 pennies an egg. The shells stayed on through the run and were peeled at the moment of eating, the salt sprinkled from a tiny twist of paper inside the bigger twist. Porters ate them on the platform at division stops, slightly apart from the white travelers, shells dropped into the cinder bed beside the rails. It was fuel for the next 4 hours and nothing more. Oxtail stew was Sunday dinner at its finest, turning bony cuts into something approaching luxury. Butchers sold oxtails cheaply because white customers wanted nothing to do with them. The tails were browned in cast iron until caramelized, then braised for hours with tomatoes, onions, and root vegetables. Long cooking released collagen from bones, creating gravy so rich it coated the spoon. The meat became impossibly tender, falling away at the slightest touch. Families served oxtail stew over rice, the grain soaking up every drop of that precious liquid. The marrow inside the bones was considered a delicacy sucked out by those who knew its value. Oxtail stew taught that patience and low heat could transform humble cuts into something magnificent, feeding families who could not afford finer meat. Molasses candy became the Christmas treat that Black mothers pulled by hand when store-bought sweets were impossible dreams during the 1930s Depression. The process started with boiling molasses, sometimes with a little sugar if available, until it reached the hard, cracked stage. The hot syrup was poured onto grease plates to cool, then pulled and stretched by buttered hands until it lightened in color and developed a glossy sheen. Children begged to help, their small hands working the warm candy as it slowly transformed from dark and sticky to golden and smooth. The finished candy was twisted into ropes and cut into pieces that would be wrapped in wax paper and hidden until Christmas morning. Making molasses candy was an event, filling the house with sweet steam and anticipation. The candy itself was intensely flavored, chewy yet brittle, tasting of patience and love. It represented what Black families could create with almost nothing but time and care.
Blackberry cobbler without sugar proved that fruit's natural sweetness could create desserts when refined sugar wasn't available. Wild blackberries grew abundantly along fence lines and in abandoned fields, free for anyone willing to brave thorns and summer heat to pick them. Black families sent children out with buckets, returning with purple-stained hands and enough berries to make cobblers that lasted days. The berries were cooked down until their juices concentrated, natural sugars intensifying without any additions. Simple biscuit dough made from flour, lard, and buttermilk was dropped over the bubbling fruit, then baked until golden. The result was tart and intense, less sweet than modern desserts, but deeply satisfying in ways sugar-laden versions never achieve. These cobblers appeared at church socials and family gatherings, proof that celebration didn't require money. Women competed quietly over whose cobbler turned out best, pride coming from skill rather than expensive ingredients. The practice of picking wild berries taught children about seasons, patience, and finding abundance in nature with steadfast pride.
Blackstrap molasses milk was a morning ritual that delivered iron, calcium, and energy in one simple glass. African American mothers stirred spoonfuls of thick, dark molasses into warm or cold milk, creating a drink both nutritious and satisfying. During the 1940s, when children needed strength for long school days and adults required fuel for demanding labor, this drink provided essential minerals refined foods couldn't match. Blackstrap molasses contained more iron than most other foods, crucial for growing children and women of childbearing age. The taste was bold, earthy, and sweet with bitter undertones, but children learned to love it because their mothers made it with care. The drink cost pennies, using milk many rural families produced from their own cows and molasses, cheaper than refined sugar. Some families drank it warm in winter and cold in summer. Blackstrap molasses milk was folk medicine and folk nutrition combined, proof that sometimes the simplest remedies work best.
Sweet potato hash was the kind of skillet meal that turned one or two inexpensive sweet potatoes into enough food to fill every stomach at the table. Mothers peeled the potatoes, sliced them thin, and mixed them with onions that softened slowly in a hot pan. As everything fried together, the sweet potatoes caramelized around the edges, their natural sugars creating a deep, warm flavor that tasted richer than anything bought in a store. The onions added sharpness that melted into sweetness as they browned, blending with the potatoes until the whole kitchen smelled like comfort. Children gathered around the stove, waiting for that moment when the potatoes were soft in the middle but crisp on the outside. Some mothers added peppers, some added nothing at all, but the meal always felt whole. Paired with cornbread or eaten straight from the pan, sweet potato hash warmed families during the coldest months. It was proof that a single vegetable, treated with care and patience, could carry an entire dinner. For families surviving the 1960s, this dish was more than affordable. It was dependable, nourishing, and full of quiet joy. Sweet potato hash was frugality turned into flavor. Dried fish from local creeks was a resource many African American families relied on when money could not stretch far enough for fresh meat. Fishermen salted the catch heavily, then hung it to dry in smoke or sun, creating a protein that lasted weeks without refrigeration. This fish was rehydrated in stews, fried in small pieces, or flaked into hash with potatoes. It smelled strong but tasted rich, filling the role of meat when meat simply was not an option. Drying fish required time, patience, and knowledge passed between generations. It was a tradition born from necessity and shaped by the environment. Families guarded these pieces carefully, knowing each strip could anchor multiple meals. When pots simmered with dried fish, the aroma meant dinner would be satisfying, even if ingredients were simple. It was survival shaped by water, fire, salt, and skill. That fish represented self-reliance, something pulled from nature, transformed by human hands, and stretched to nourish as many mouths as possible. Kids watched their elders clean, salt, and hang the fish, learning not just a recipe but a way of life built on resourcefulness. Dried fish was more than food. It was a lesson in endurance, pride, and making the most of what the world offered. Molasses milk drink was a simple tonic born of necessity, offering sweetness when refined sugar was out of reach. Families mixed molasses into milk, creating a drink that was both nourishing and affordable. It carried iron and minerals, making it valuable in diets that often lacked variety. For children, it was a treat that felt special, even though it was made from the most modest ingredients. For adults, it was a way to stretch resources while still providing something comforting and energizing. Molasses was cheaper and more accessible than sugar, and milk was often thin or limited, but together they created something memorable. This drink became a symbol of survival, proving that dignity could be found in even the simplest recipes. It carried both sweetness and strength, lifting spirits in households where struggle was constant. Molasses milk drink was not just sustenance, but a reminder of how small comforts helped families endure during the harshest years of segregation. Dandelion leaf salad was the first taste of spring after long winters of waiting. Before gardens ripened and store shelves filled, families went out with baskets to gather the wild greens sprouting between stones and fences. The leaves were sharp and bitter, full of life, dressed with bacon grease, and a drizzle of warm vinegar to tame their sting. When topped with sliced eggs or onions, the salad turned humble foraged greens into something worth celebrating. It carried the smell of open air, of wet soil and renewal, of hard work rewarded. Eating it was a kind of homecoming, the body remembering the land it came from. Every bite crackled with freshness, earthy and alive, tasting like the world waking up. It was not fancy, but it was honest, a meal earned by hand and heart. Dandelion leaf salad reminded everyone that food was more than what you planted. It was what you noticed, what you respected, what you were grateful for. It was a meal that whispered of beginnings and belonging, both wild and tender at once. Beaten biscuits with country ham were a labor of love, both in preparation and flavor. The biscuit dough was made with flour, lard, and water, then pounded, sometimes hundreds of strokes, with a rolling pin or mallet until perfectly smooth. This beating gave the biscuits their dense, cracker-like texture. Once baked, they were split open and filled with thin slices of salty, cured country ham, creating a sharp contrast between the savory meat and the plain biscuit. These sandwiches were popular for church gatherings, community meetings, and packed lunches, as they traveled well without spoiling quickly. During the Civil Rights era, the ham was often sliced paper-thin to make it stretch, especially when feeding large families or guests. The preparation of beaten biscuits was often a group effort, with family members taking turns at the pounding, turning the process into both work and tradition. The result was a humble but memorable bite that carried the taste of Southern kitchens and the persistence of those who kept these methods alive. Salt herring stew was the kind of dish that reflected both poverty and practicality, built from a cheap ingredient that lasted months without spoiling. Salted herring was affordable because it was preserved fish that needed soaking and boiling before eating. Families rehydrated it and cooked it with onions, potatoes, and sometimes a little milk when it was available. What came out of the pot was salty, savory, and strong enough to stand as a main meal. It was not glamorous, but it gave protein and energy to men who worked long days of labor. Housewives could make a single fish stretch across several servings, the broth thickening with potatoes to make it more filling. It carried a sense of the sea even in inland communities, a reminder of trade routes that made cheap protein possible. Salt herring stew was survival food, but it was also comfort for those who ate it, proof that even the harshest flavors could be turned into something sustaining.
Number 23, fatback and grits. If you grew up in a sharecropper's household in Georgia or South Carolina in the 1940s, your morning started the same way every day: a slice of fatback fried in a cast iron skillet until the edges curled and the grease pooled. Then a bowl of grits cooked in water with that rendered fat stirred through. Fatback cost almost nothing because white families did not want it. Butchers sold it for pennies a pound, and the salt preserved it for months. For black children, this was breakfast every single day. Not sometimes, every day. The fat kept you full through hours of walking miles to the segregated school that had no cafeteria. Nutritionists would later call this diet deficient. The families who survived on it called it Tuesday. Ash cakes were the bread of necessity, baked directly in hot coals when no proper oven or skillet was available. Black families mixed coarse cornmeal with water and salt, shaped the dough into flat cakes, wrapped them in dampened corn husks, and buried them in the hot ashes of the hearth. The leaves protected the dough while surrounding heat baked it slowly into dense, smoky bread with distinctive charred flavor. This method required no fuel beyond what was already burning, no equipment beyond hands, and no ingredients beyond basic staples. Enslaved people and sharecroppers relied on ash cakes when they had nothing else, creating sustenance from fire and cornmeal alone. The cakes were filling and portable, perfect for carrying to fields or eating cold the next morning. This ancient method connected black families to African traditions. Crackling bread transformed the crispy remnants of rendered pork fat into cornbread that satisfied like no other. When families rendered lard from pork fat, the bits of skin and meat that remained became cracklings, golden nuggets of pure pork flavor, too precious to discard. These cracklings were folded directly into cornbread batter, so every bite contained bursts of salty, smoky richness. The bread baked golden in cast iron skillets, the fat from cracklings keeping it moist while adding depth plain cornbread could never achieve. For families who could only afford the cheapest scraps, crackling bread represented abundance and resourcefulness. Children fought over corner pieces where extra cracklings had settled, knowing those bites were treasures. This bread stretched a single hog, rendering into multiple meals. Number 26, sardines and soda crackers. A tin of sardines cost about 5 cents in 1930, and a sleeve of soda crackers cost 3. For under a dime, a Pullman porter could feed himself between Memphis and Cincinnati without setting foot in the white dining car. The tin opened with a key that doubled as a souvenir, and the oil from the fish soaked the crackers into something almost soft. Porters ate it sitting on the stairs of the baggage car, knees together, careful not to stain the trouser crease. It was an immigrant's meal, turned black working man's meal, turned railroad meal. It traveled well, never spoiled, and asked nothing of the man eating it. The empty tin went into the pail's bottom pocket on the return trip, useful for nails, buttons, or the small change a porter set aside for his daughter's school shoes once the run was done. Red rice carried flavors of West Africa across the Atlantic, surviving through generations who kept the tradition alive. The dish combined long grain rice with tomatoes, onions, and rendered bacon fat, the tomatoes staining every grain deep red. Some families added smoked sausage or bacon, while others relied solely on fat for richness. The rice cooked slowly until each grain absorbed tomatoes' tang and pork's smokiness. It was served as side dish or meal unto itself, substantial enough to satisfy without expensive protein. Red rice appeared at church suppers and reunions, each cook's version slightly different based on handed-down techniques. The dish connected Black families to Gula traditions and coastal cooking predating their American experience. Red rice was memory-made edible, heritage preserved one pot at a time. Fried salt pork with red-eye gravy was the Christmas morning protein that sustained 1930s Black families when fresh meat remained an impossible luxury. Salt pork, cured slabs of fatty pork belly, kept for months without refrigeration, making it the reliable standby in every kitchen. Sliced thin and fried slowly in cast iron until the edges crisped and the fat rendered golden, salt pork delivered intense, salty satisfaction. The real magic came after. Strong black coffee was poured into the hot skillet, sizzling and bubbling as it mixed with the pork drippings to create red-eye gravy. This thin, bitter, salty sauce was poured over biscuits or grits, stretching a few slices of salt pork into breakfast for an entire family. The dish cost pennies, yet tasted like abundance to children who knew nothing better. Salt pork with red-eye gravy represented survival wisdom, the knowledge that preservation and technique could transform cheap ingredients into Christmas morning comfort.
Sweet potato pie without sugar became an ingenious solution when refined sugar cost more than most families could afford. Black cooks relied on the sweet potatoes' natural sugars, roasting them until their starches converted to sweetness that rivaled any added sugar. The potatoes were mashed smooth, then mixed with a little flour, whatever milk or buttermilk could be spared, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg if the spice tin held any. This mixture was poured into simple pastry crusts made from lard and flour, then baked until set. The result wasn't as sweet as modern pies, but it carried deep, earthy flavors that spoke of autumn harvests and survival through winter. Sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern gardens, storing well in root cellars for months after harvest. Families who grew their own could make pies throughout fall and winter, stretching one crop across countless meals. In Black communities, sweet potato pie represented celebration despite poverty, proof that special occasions deserved recognition even when money was absent. Children looked forward to these pies as rare treats, savoring every bite of something that felt luxurious despite humble ingredients through shared sacrifice.
Chitterlings represented the ultimate expression of waste-nothing cooking, transforming pig intestines into a dish that families anticipated all year. Cleaning chitterlings was labor-intensive work that took hours of scrubbing, soaking, and rinsing until every trace of impurity was gone. Once cleaned, they were simmered with onions, vinegar, and red pepper flakes until tender and richly flavored. The smell filled entire neighborhoods, announcing that something special was cooking. During wartime, when butchers sold these scraps for almost nothing, chitterlings provided affordable protein that stretched tight budgets. African American families served them during holidays, transforming what others considered waste into celebration food. The texture was unique, tender, and slightly chewy, with a flavor that inspired fierce loyalty among those who loved them. Children often wrinkled their noses at first, but many grew to crave the dish as adults. Chitterlings carried cultural memory forward, connecting 1940s families to survival traditions.
Chicken necks and dumplings were a version of chicken and dumplings that made the most out of the least. Necks were one of the cheapest poultry parts, offering flavor even if they held only scraps of meat. Mothers boiled them with onions, celery, and seasoning until the broth turned rich and deeply comforting. Dumplings made from flour, water, and a little fat were dropped into the pot, swelling as they soaked up the broth. The dumplings provided most of the substance, while the necks gave the stew its flavor. Children loved the soft, doughy dumplings and the warmth the dish brought to cold evenings. Some families stretched the pot by adding potatoes or carrots, while others kept it simple, letting the broth and dumplings carry the meal on their own. The long simmering time filled the home with the kind of aroma that drew children to the kitchen just to peek inside the pot. For mothers, it was a reliable way to feed many mouths without worrying about running out. Chicken necks and dumplings were proof that comfort did not require abundance. Leftover bones saved for broth were one of the greatest acts of Depression-era ingenuity. When meat was a rarity, bones were never thrown away. They were the foundation of meals. Grandmothers simmered them for hours with onions, scraps of vegetables, and whatever seasoning they had, pulling every bit of flavor from bone to water. The result was a rich, savory broth that fed families across several meals. Rice, dumplings, or vegetables added to the pot created dishes that tasted far more generous than the ingredients allowed. Bones could be reused more than once, simmered again until every trace of nourishment had been pulled free. This was not just frugality, it was survival passed down through generations, where even the barest ingredients could become a pot of comfort. Families gathered around bowls of broth that warmed bodies and spirits after long days of hard work. Children learned early that bones carried more value than they appeared to, holding flavor that could be coaxed out with patience and care. These broths formed the backbone of many Depression-era dishes, quietly proving that resourcefulness could turn almost nothing into something sustaining. Fried pork ears may sound unusual now, but they were once a common delicacy in African American kitchens, born out of the need to use every part of the pig. Pork ears, often discarded or sold cheaply, were cleaned, boiled until tender, then fried until crisp. Seasoned well, they carried a chewy, crunchy texture that turned scraps into something worth savoring. This dish reflected the ingenuity of cooks who refused to waste anything and who turned necessity into culture. Fried pork ears were often shared at gatherings, eaten as snacks, or paired with greens and cornbread for a complete meal. They symbolized thrift and pride, proof that nothing was beneath the skill of a determined cook. In times of segregation, when resources were limited and dignity often denied, fried pork ears represented taking control of what little was available and making it meaningful. The dish was a testament to resilience, resourcefulness, and the power of flavor to uplift even the hardest times. Stewed rabbit with wild herbs was the kind of meal that came from both patience and the land itself. When grocery shelves were bare, families turned to the woods, hunting small game that could stretch into a week's worth of meals. The rabbit was cleaned and cut into pieces, then stewed slowly with onions, wild garlic, thyme, and sage picked fresh from the edges of fields. It simmered until the meat fell from the bone, the broth turning golden and rich. Every spoonful carried the scent of grass, earth, and smoke from the fire it cooked over. The flavor was mild yet wild, tasting of open air and effort. This dish was not about luxury. It was about knowing how to survive without giving up the comfort of good food. Children would sit quiet, waiting for their bowl, while elders talked about how every herb had a story of healing and endurance. Served with cornbread or a spoonful of rice, stewed rabbit with wild herbs tasted like survival turned into ritual. It was a reminder that the South's truest recipes were born not from plenty, but from respect for the land, for hunger, and for the art of making something honest out of hardship. Black-eyed pea fritters were a crispy, golden reminder of African culinary heritage. Known in West Africa as akara, they made their way into African American kitchens through generations of passed-down cooking. Dried black-eyed peas were soaked, peeled, and ground into a thick paste, then seasoned with salt, onion, and sometimes hot pepper. Small spoonfuls of the mixture were dropped into hot oil and fried until puffed and browned. The outside had a satisfying crunch while the inside stayed tender and savory. They could be eaten alone with a hot sauce drizzle or alongside greens and cornbread. During the Civil Rights era, they were an affordable way to feed many mouths quickly, especially at gatherings before or after community meetings. Black-eyed pea fritters traveled well, making them a practical snack to carry during long days of organizing and protesting. Beyond their affordability, they carried the taste of history, a direct link back to African foodways that had survived slavery and segregation. In a time when cultural pride was a quiet act of resistance, Frying up a batch of black-eyed pea fritters was both sustenance and a way to keep tradition alive. Pickled okra pods were a bright, tangy counterpoint to heavier meals, bringing both crunch and flavor to the table. Fresh okra was packed into jars with vinegar, garlic, dill, and often a pinch of red pepper flakes for heat. The jars were sealed and left to sit, allowing the brine to work its magic. The pickling not only preserved the okra, but also made it a refreshing side dish that could be enjoyed long after the growing season had ended. During the Civil Rights era, when store-bought pickles could be a luxury, home-pickled vegetables were a staple in many African American households. Pickled okra was eaten straight from the jar as a snack, chopped into salads, or served alongside fried fish and cornbread. The process was a way to make the most of a garden's bounty, ensuring that nothing went to waste. It was also a communal task, with families often gathering to pickle together, swapping jars and recipes. In a time of uncertainty, a jar of pickled okra in the pantry meant a burst of brightness was always within reach, adding both flavor and a small reminder of self-reliance. Pot liquor soup was not something that appeared fancy on a table, but it was a lifeline in kitchens where nothing could go to waste. When greens like collards or turnip tops were boiled down, the dark liquid left in the pot carried vitamins and flavor. That liquid, known as pot liquor, was never thrown out. Instead, it was sopped up with pieces of cornbread or saved as broth for later meals. Housewives often seasoned it with onion, a touch of fat, or whatever scraps were on hand, turning it into a meal by itself. After hours in the fields, dipping cornbread into that broth meant warmth, fullness, and strength for the next day. Pot liquor carried not just nutrition, but a tradition of making sure even the water used in cooking was valued. In the hands of families who lived on tight margins, it became a symbol of resilience. It proved that survival often came from using every last drop.
Number 24, pot liquor and cornbread. When your grandmother finished simmering a pot of collard greens with a ham hock, the greens went to Sunday dinner, but the broth, that dark, smoky liquid left behind in the pot, that was the real treasure. Pot liquor was loaded with vitamins A, C, and K, along with iron that leached from the greens during hours of slow cooking. Enslaved cooks on the South's plantations poured off this liquid after preparing meals for the families that held them in bondage and carried it back to their own quarters. They soaked cornbread in it until it fell apart, and that was supper. In the 1920s, sharecropper wives in Alabama served pot liquor with crumbled cornbread to their children as a full meal 5 nights a week. For Black families, this was never a debate. It was dinner. Cowpea cakes turned leftover black-eyed peas into crispy fritters that satisfied hunger when nothing else remained. Black families mashed cooked cowpeas with a little flour, onion, and seasoning, then shaped the mixture into patties and fried them in hot fat until golden brown. The cakes developed a crunchy exterior while the inside stayed creamy and rich with earthy pea flavor. This dish stretched a single pot of peas into multiple meals, served for breakfast with eggs, for lunch between bread, or for dinner alongside greens. Cowpeas grew easily in poor southern soil, requiring little attention and providing nitrogen that helped other crops thrive. The cakes could be eaten hot or packed cold for field workers, making them versatile survival food. Each crispy bite represented the ingenuity of cooks who refused to let food go to waste. Number 25, sweet potato pie in a mason jar. This is the meal that explains who Pullman Porters actually were. By 1925, the Pullman Palace Car Company was the single largest employer of Black men in the United States, and the men they hired came almost entirely from Southern households where sweet potatoes were the cheapest sweet food a mother could put on a table. A nickel of potatoes, a spoon of lard, a pinch of brown sugar, a dust of nutmeg if the cupboard had any. The pie came out of the oven on a Saturday night, was cooled overnight, and on Sunday morning his wife scooped a thick slice into a clean mason jar and screwed the lid down tight. That jar rode in the bottom of the tin pail across 2,000 miles. It was the part nobody notices about the porter's life. The country saw a black man in a starched white jacket smiling at strangers for 14 hours straight, lifting trunks, shining shoes, hauling slop buckets, taking insults that came with a tip. What the country did not see was the jar at the bottom of the pail. The porter would eat the pie cold, sitting on a wooden crate in the porter's room behind the coal car, the spoon scraping the glass. It was sweet, dense, and it carried his wife's hands in it. Pullman paid him $67.50 a month in 1926 and expected him to buy his own uniform, his own polish, his own meals. The jar of pie was the part of the run that nobody paid for and the part that kept him from breaking. When A. Philip Randolph started organizing the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters that year, he understood that the fight was never just about wages. It was about whose dignity rode in the bottom of the pail. Molasses bread provided sweetness and sustenance when refined sugar was beyond reach for most black families. The loaves were dense and dark, sweetened with blackstrap molasses that added minerals along with its deep sweetness. Women mixed dough with cornmeal or wheat flour depending on availability, adding ginger or cinnamon when the pantry allowed. The bread baked slowly in wood-fired ovens, emerging with dark crust that crackled when sliced. Children spread it with butter or ate it plain, savoring rich flavor, satisfying sweet cravings without expensive ingredients. Molasses bread lasted well, staying moist for days in covered crocks. Families ate it for breakfast, packed it in lunch pails, and served it with supper. The bread represented making do beautifully, creating something special from the most affordable sweetener. Vinegar pie emerged as the Christmas dessert of necessity in 1930s black households when lemons were imported, luxuries no family could justify. The filling was simple: sugar, flour, butter, eggs, and sharp white vinegar providing tartness without citrus. Mixed together and poured into a homemade crust, the pie baked into a smooth custard that trembled slightly when moved. The flavor surprised those expecting something harsh, delivering instead a balanced sweetness cut with gentle acidity that cleaned the palate after rich holiday meals. The pie cost pennies since every ingredient was a pantry staple, yet it tasted special enough for Christmas. Children often didn't know what gave the pie its distinctive tang, and mothers rarely told. Vinegar pie represented the ingenuity of black cooks who refused to let poverty mean going without dessert, who understood that substitution and creativity could produce something genuinely delicious. The pie proved that Christmas sweetness came from love, not expensive ingredients.
Cornmeal sacks were as essential as breathing, and every family knew it. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and dependable, something you could use in a dozen different ways without wasting a single grain. Families used it for cornbread that stretched a pot of beans, hoe cakes cooked right on the stovetop, dumplings dropped into broth, and even as a thickener when soups needed to last another day. The sacks sat in corners of pantries, tied tight to keep pests out, often lasting weeks at a time because people used cornmeal daily. Kids learned early how to scoop it with steady hands. Knowing a little went a long way. Cornmeal was the base of survival cooking, humble but mighty. It kept families full when nothing else was guaranteed, proving that simple food could be powerful when stretched with skill and love.
Molasses bread carried families through the leanest months of wartime rationing when white sugar vanished from store shelves and flour grew scarce. African American cooks mixed dark, robust molasses with cornmeal, a little lard, and whatever flour they could spare, creating dense loaves that baked into something deeply satisfying. The bread emerged from wood-fired ovens with a dark crust and moist interior that tasted of earth, sweetness, and survival. Sliced thick and eaten with butter or alongside beans, it provided carbohydrates and iron that working families desperately needed. Molasses was cheaper than sugar and packed with nutrients refined sweeteners lacked, making it both practical and healthful. Churches served this bread at fellowship meals, and mothers baked it for children attending segregated schools. The loaves kept well for days, allowing families to bake once and eat throughout the week. Molasses bread was proof that Black cooks could transform humble ingredients into something worth savoring.
Smothered chicken backs were one of the cheapest ways to turn poultry into a family dinner. Backs had little meat but plenty of flavor, and mothers knew exactly how to coax that flavor into a rich pot of gravy. After browning the backs in a skillet, they sprinkled flour to build a roux, then added water or broth until it thickened. The backs simmered until tender, releasing every bit of taste into the gravy. Served over rice, the result was comforting and hearty despite the humble ingredients. Children rarely noticed that the pieces were scraps. They only knew it tasted good. Mothers loved this dish because it stretched one small purchase into a whole pot of food that could carry a family through the evening. The gravy soaked into the rice perfectly, making every bite feel warm and satisfying. Smothered chicken backs were creativity at its finest, turning what others ignored into something worth gathering around. Rendered lard stored in tins was pure gold in Depression kitchens, especially in African American households that knew how to stretch every resource: lard-fried chicken, seasoned beans, flavored greens, baked biscuits, and made pie crusts flaky, even when butter was a distant dream. Families saved every bit of fat they could, rendering it slow until it turned liquid, then letting it cool into a smooth white block that lasted for weeks. A spoonful added richness to meals that otherwise would have tasted plain. Grandmothers guarded their lard tins like treasure because they understood just how far it could go. In a time when nothing was wasted, lard became one of the most valuable ingredients in the home, turning scraps and basics into meals that felt whole. Souse meat, often called head cheese, was a dish that ensured no part of the pig ever went to waste. Families would boil pig heads, scraping the meat, fat, and skin into a broth that thickened naturally with gelatin. Once pressed into pans and cooled, it became a savory terrine that could be sliced and eaten with bread or crackers. Though humble in origins, it was a way of stretching resources into something filling and practical. For African American families during segregation, souse meat symbolized ingenuity, showing how even discarded parts could be transformed into a sustaining dish. It was often seasoned with vinegar, pepper, and spices to brighten its flavor, making it feel like more than just scraps. Children sometimes hesitated at its unusual look, but adults valued it for keeping hunger away. Souse meat was food born of thrift, history, and necessity, carrying both tradition and resilience to every table it touched. It represented survival cooking at its most determined and creative. Turnip top fritters were the green heartbeat of thrift. Made from chopped turnip greens, cornmeal, and salt, they sizzled in oil until brown and crisp, filling the room with a smell that was sharp and comforting. The taste was earthy and bright, with a bitterness that faded into warmth. These fritters took what was often tossed aside and made it into something worth gathering around. Grandmothers fried them by the dozen, stacking them high on paper towels to soak the grease. They were eaten hot, with fingers or forks, and gone before the next batch left the pan. Turnip top fritters reminded families that waste was a choice and flavor was everywhere if you looked close enough. They were green, humble, and perfectly Southern. Turnip green soup was the embodiment of making the most of what the garden offered. In the civil rights era, fresh produce often came from backyard gardens or community plots, and turnip greens were prized for their hardiness and nutrition. This soup began with a pot of simmering water or broth, to which chopped greens were added along with onions, garlic, and sometimes diced turnips for extra body. A ham hock or small piece of salt pork, if available, would be added for smoky depth, but the soup could also be kept entirely vegetable-based when meat was scarce. The greens broke down into a flavorful broth that was both hearty and comforting, perfect for spooning over cornbread or serving alongside rice. It was a dish that could be kept warm on the stove all day, feeding anyone who stopped by. In homes where every scrap of food mattered, turnip green soup was a way to turn a humble harvest into a communal meal. Its warmth nourished not just the body, but the spirit, reminding everyone at the table of the power of simple shared sustenance in uncertain times. Stewed cow peas with salt pork was a dish that carried deep roots from African traditions into Southern kitchens, feeding families who needed filling food without paying for expensive meats. Cow peas were hardy, cheap, and easy to grow, which made them a dependable crop for families that worked the land. When paired with fatty scraps of salt pork, the peas took on a richness that made the whole pot taste far more luxurious than it really was. Housewives would simmer the pot low and slow, letting the flavor of the pork seep into every spoonful. The peas softened, the broth thickened, and what began as humble ingredients turned into a dish that could feed many mouths. It was the kind of food that worked both as supper after the fields and as leftovers for the next day's work lunch. This was survival food in every sense of the word, simple but steady, and always stretching farther than anyone thought possible.
Number 19, chitterling stew transformed pig intestines into something that divided families. You either loved it or couldn't stand the smell. The chitterlings required hours of cleaning before they could be cooked, a process that tested patience but rewarded dedication. Once cleaned, they were simmered with onions, garlic, vinegar, and hot peppers until tender and flavorful. Some cooks added potatoes or tomatoes to stretch the stew. The aroma was distinctive and powerful, announcing to the entire neighborhood what was cooking. For many families, chitterling stew was holiday food served at Christmas or New Year's alongside other traditional dishes. Children grew up with strong opinions about this stew, shaped by whether their families embraced or avoided it. The dish represented cultural continuity, a connection to ancestors who wasted nothing. Corn cob jelly transformed kitchen scraps into a golden honey-like spread that sweetened biscuits and cornbread. After families ate fresh corn, the bare cobs were boiled for hours to extract their natural sugars and pectin, creating a liquid that set into delicate jelly when combined with sugar. This jelly tasted faintly of corn with a sweetness that rivaled expensive store-bought preserves. Black families made it during late summer when corn was plentiful, stretching the harvest into something that lasted through winter. The process required patience and fuel, but no additional cost beyond sugar, turning garbage into treasure. Children spread corn cob jelly thick on their breakfast bread, never knowing they were eating something born from scraps. This recipe demonstrated how nothing needed to be wasted when knowledge met necessity. Number 14, molasses bread for the last leg. Molasses cost about 12 cents a quart at a corner grocery in 1930, and it was the cheapest sweetener a black household could keep on the shelf. Porters' wives baked a dense brown loaf on Saturday using flour, soda, a single egg, and a heavy pull of dark molasses, and they sliced it thick for the back end of the run. The slices traveled in a folded square of wax paper at the top of the tin pail, where they would not crush under the heavier jars and tins. By the time the porter reached the last leg between Atlanta and Washington, the sweet bread was the only thing left in the pail. He ate it standing in the corridor, a slice in one hand, his cap tucked under the other arm. It was sugar enough to walk a man home. Hog maw was pig stomach cleaned, stuffed, and roasted until it became a dish feeding crowds during the 1920s. Preparing it required dedication, scrubbing the stomach thoroughly before stuffing with sausage, potatoes, onions, and seasonings. The stuffed stomach was sewn shut and roasted slowly until everything inside was tender and exterior crisped. When sliced, it revealed layers of filling surrounded by chewy, flavorful stomach lining. Black families served hog maw at holidays, the centerpiece of tables that might otherwise seem sparse. The dish used a part costing almost nothing while creating something impressive. Children watched mothers and grandmothers prepare it, learning the careful cleaning process. Hog maw represented transformation, turning what others rejected into something families celebrated together. Cornmeal dressing replaced traditional bread stuffing in 1930s Black Christmas kitchens when wheat flour prices climbed beyond reach. Cornbread was crumbled days ahead and left to dry, then combined with sautéed onions, celery from the garden, sage, and whatever drippings could be saved. The mixture was moistened with pot liquor or broth, packed into baking pans, and baked until the top turned golden and crusty while the inside stayed moist. Some families added giblets or oysters when available, but most kept it simple and let the cornbread's earthy sweetness carry the dish. Cornmeal dressing appeared alongside whatever protein the family could manage, chicken, rabbit, or wild game, stretching the meal further while providing filling satisfaction. Children loved the crispy corner pieces best, fighting over them at the table. The dish represented practical wisdom, using cheap and available ingredients to create something festive. Cornmeal dressing proved Christmas flavor came from care and seasoning, not expensive ingredients.
Cornmeal mush carried Black families through mornings when there was nothing else to put on the table but determination and resourcefulness. Coarse, stone-ground cornmeal was stirred into boiling water with salt, the wooden spoon moving constantly to prevent lumps from forming in the thick porridge. The mixture bubbled and spat as it cooked, thickening until it pulled away from the sides of the pot in one smooth mass. Some families added a precious spoonful of lard for richness. Others made do with just meal and water. Served hot in bowls, this mush provided the calories needed to get through days of backbreaking labor in fields or domestic service. Children ate it before walking miles to segregated schools, their bellies full even if the meal was plain. In urban Black neighborhoods of Chicago and Detroit, families who'd migrated north during the Great Migration continued making cornmeal mush, connecting them to Southern roots and survival traditions. Leftover mush was poured into pans to set overnight, then sliced and fried the next morning for breakfast with patient care.
Oxtail stew transformed a cut that butchers practically gave away into one of the most flavorful dishes in African American cooking. The bony tails were browned in cast iron, then braised for hours with onions, tomatoes, and whatever root vegetables the garden provided until the meat fell from the bone. The collagen in the bones melted into the cooking liquid, creating a thick, rich gravy that coated every ingredient with silky richness. During the 1940s, when better cuts of beef were rationed or too expensive, oxtails provided deep, beefy flavor at a fraction of the cost. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread to soak up every drop of the precious gravy. The meat required patience. There was no rushing oxtails, but the reward was worth every hour of simmering. Children learned to work around the bones, finding tender meat in every crevice. Oxtail stew was Sunday dinner for families who knew that the cheapest cuts often delivered the richest flavors.
Black-eyed pea soup was one of the most dependable winter meals because peas were cheap, nutritious, and able to stretch across multiple days. Mothers cooked them slowly with onions, seasoning, and scraps of bone or fat to deepen the flavor. As the peas broke down, the soup thickened into something hearty enough to anchor a dinner. Children gathered around the table with cornbread ready to dunk into their bowls. The soup warmed cold hands and filled hungry stomachs, offering comfort in every spoonful. Some families added rice to stretch it even further, turning one pot into several meals. The longer it simmered, the more the flavors blended together. Black-eyed pea soup did more than feed a family. It kept hope alive on the hardest days. Black-eyed pea soup was survival on the stove, steady and reassuring. Home-canned peaches and pears were treasures stored away with the care of something sacred. Families spent late summer picking, peeling, and preserving fruit in jars so there would be something sweet to look forward to when winter felt endless. Those jars lined shelves like colorful reminders that better days had existed and would come again. Opening one was an event. Kids listened for the pop, adults smiled, and everyone knew dessert was going to feel special. Sometimes the fruit was eaten straight from the jar, sometimes spooned over cornbread, and sometimes served on holiday tables like it was fine gold. In a world where sweetness was rare, these jars felt like hope preserved in glass. Those fruits stretched holidays, Sundays, and hard nights alike. They brought sunshine into cold kitchens. They were sweetness, literally saved for survival. Stewed chicken gizzards were a dish that made the most of what others often discarded, turning affordable organ meat into something hearty and flavorful. Gizzards, tough at first, were simmered low and slow in gravies or broths until they became tender enough to eat with rice or cornbread. For African American families, gizzards provided necessary protein without the high cost of more popular cuts. The long cooking time made them stretch further, with gravy-filling bowls and bellies when meat itself was scarce. Children might have turned their noses up at first, but once seasoned and cooked properly, the dish carried a rich flavor that reminded families of the skill and care needed to make something valuable from scraps. Stewed chicken gizzards embodied resilience, thrift, and the deep culinary knowledge passed down through generations. They kept hunger away and showed that survival was not only about what was available, but about how you prepared it. In lean times, gizzards were a lifeline on the stove. Corncob jelly was sweetness made from what everyone else would have thrown away. When the kernels were long gone, grandmothers gathered the empty cobs, boiled them until the water blushed golden, and stirred in sugar until it gleamed like melted sunlight. The scent filled the air, soft and buttery, with a whisper of summer still clinging to the pot. Once cooled, it set into a glossy jelly, clear as amber and delicate as spun glass. Spread on biscuits or cornbread, it shimmered in the morning light, tasting faintly of cornfields and warm days. There was something almost magical in the way it turned waste into beauty, a sweet defiance against hunger and hardship. Each jar of corncob jelly held more than flavor. It held proof that nothing in a southern kitchen was ever truly useless. It was passed between neighbors, sold at church socials, or gifted with a ribbon tied around the lid. For families who had little, it brought luxury to breakfast and hope to the table. Corncob jelly was not just food, it was gratitude preserved. Molasses glazed carrots were a dish that made the most of a humble garden harvest. Carrots were peeled, sliced, and simmered until just tender, then tossed in a glossy glaze made from molasses, butter, and a touch of salt. The molasses gave the dish a deep, slightly smoky sweetness that was far richer than plain sugar. It was an inexpensive way to dress up a common vegetable, turning it into something worthy of a Sunday dinner table. During the Civil Rights era, this recipe was especially valued because it could be prepared from ingredients already in the pantry and garden. Molasses was a cheaper sweetener than refined sugar and lasted a long time on the shelf. Carrots, grown in backyard plots or received from neighbors, were available for much of the year. The dish was often paired with roasted meats or stews, its sweetness balancing savory flavors. Families would sometimes make extra, knowing it would reheat well for another meal. In kitchens where nothing was wasted, molasses glazed carrots showed that care in seasoning and presentation could elevate even the simplest produce into something memorable. Cabbage and onions fried in lard was a one-pan dish that brought comfort after long hours of heavy labor. Cabbage was one of the cheapest vegetables available, and onions were easy to grow or trade with neighbors. When cooked together in hot lard, they transformed into something warm, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. Housewives could chop them quickly, fry them in minutes, and have a hot meal ready with little effort. The smell filled kitchens, reminding families that even the humblest foods had power when prepared with care. For working men, this dish meant nourishment at the end of a punishing day. For children, it meant they would go to bed with full stomachs. Though plain, it became a comfort food because it met the need for warmth, nutrition, and ease. Cabbage and onions fried in lard reflected the kind of meals that carried African American families through survival with resourcefulness and strength.
Number 21, ash cakes. Before hoe cakes, there were ash cakes. This was the oldest bread in Black American history. Cornmeal and water shaped into flat rounds and buried directly in the hot ashes of a fireplace. Susan Kelly, born into slavery in Virginia, was interviewed at the age of 100 in the 1930s and described her mother's method of raking the ashes aside, placing the cakes on hot bricks, then covering them with more ashes until they turned brown. You washed them off with water and ate them warm. That was it. After emancipation, ash cakes survived because many formerly enslaved families had no stove, no oven, and no money. A fireplace and a handful of cornmeal was all you needed. By the 1960s, the recipe had disappeared. The last generation that knew how to make them never thought to write it down. No one did. Pea flour dumplings were born when wheat flour was too expensive and dried peas were all that remained in the pantry. Black families ground dried field peas into coarse flour, mixed it with water and salt, then dropped spoonfuls into simmering broth or stew. The dumplings had an earthy, nutty flavor distinct from wheat, filling bellies with protein-rich sustenance that cost almost nothing. This technique stretched a pot of thin soup into a complete meal, the dumplings absorbing liquid and swelling into substantial bites. Mothers made these when grocery money ran out before the week ended, turning poverty into nourishment through ingenuity. The dumplings were dense and hearty, designed to fill empty stomachs and provide energy for work. Each bite carried the taste of survival and the creativity that made it possible. Number 15, catfish fried the morning of the run. Catfish was cheap river food in the Black neighborhoods of Memphis and Vicksburg, sold by weight off the back of a flat wagon for around 15 cents a pound in 1929. A porter's wife would dredge 2 small fillets in seasoned cornmeal at 5 in the morning, fry them quick in lard, and lay them on brown paper to cool while her husband shined his shoes at the kitchen table. The fillets went into the tin pail wrapped in wax paper, the cornmeal crust holding the heat for 2 hours and the flavor for 10. Porters ate them cold at the first long stop, peeling the paper back with 2 fingers. The fish never tasted as good as it had at dawn, but it tasted like home, and that was the only review that mattered on a 36-hour run. Sorghum and biscuits brought sweetness to tables where refined sugar was a luxury few could afford. Sorghum syrup was made from tall cane-like stalks, pressed and boiled into thick amber syrup with flavor deeper than molasses. Black families drizzled it over hot buttermilk biscuits, the syrup pooling in golden puddles, soaking into tender crumb. Children considered this a treat, while adults valued how natural sugars provided quick energy for field work. Some families grew their own sorghum, taking stalks to community mills. Others purchased it from neighbors at prices lower than store-bought sweeteners. Sorghum with biscuits became breakfast and dessert, sometimes both. The syrup kept well through winter when fresh fruits were unavailable. This simple pairing proved satisfaction did not require wealth. Persimmon pudding appeared on 1930s Black Christmas tables as nature's gift transformed into silky spiced dessert that cost nothing but gathering and patience. Wild persimmons grew freely throughout the South, their wrinkled orange fruit sweetening after the first frost turned them soft. Women and children gathered them by the bucketful, mashing the pulp through colanders, to remove seeds and skin. The sweet puree was mixed with flour, milk, eggs, and warm spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, then baked slowly until set into a pudding with texture between custard and cake. The flavor was unlike anything store-bought, deeply sweet with hints of honey and dates, earthy and wild. Children loved it because it tasted like candy, while adults appreciated that the main ingredient came free from the woods. Persimmon pudding connected families to the land and to traditions older than anyone could remember, proving that the best Christmas desserts sometimes grew on trees waiting to be found. Smothered chicken stretched a single bird into Christmas dinner for large 1930s Black families through the alchemy of slow cooking and rich gravy. Yard birds, chickens raised in backyard coops, were too valuable for everyday eating, reserved instead for occasions like Christmas when sacrifice and celebration merged. The chicken was cut into pieces, seasoned with salt and pepper, then browned in a cast iron skillet before being covered with sliced onions and a lid. It cooked low and slow, the onions melting into sweet submission, while the chicken released juices that became gravy. The long cooking made even tough old hens tender and flavorful, stretching one chicken to feed 10 or more when served over rice with plenty of gravy. Every piece was claimed, from drumsticks to backs, with children learning that nothing on a chicken went to waste. Smothered chicken taught that patience and technique transformed scarcity into feast, that Christmas dinner depended on skill as much as ingredients.
Okra soup stretched vegetables into filling meals that provided nutrition and comfort during impossible economic times. Fresh okra from summer gardens or dried okra stored from previous harvests went into pots with tomatoes, onions, and whatever else the garden provided. The okra released natural thickeners as it cooked, creating viscous soup that coated the spoon and filled empty stomachs. Black cooks added rice to make the soup even more substantial, transforming a few vegetables into meals for entire families. The dish carried flavors that connected African American communities to West African ancestors who had cooked similar soups for centuries. In rural Louisiana and South Carolina, okra soup appeared regularly because okra grew prolifically in southern heat. The slime that some people found off-putting became crucial for thickening without expensive starches or cream. Families ate this soup with cornbread, using the bread to soak up every drop of precious broth. Children grew up loving okra soup's unique texture, finding comfort in its warmth and fullness despite systematic oppression.
Neck bones and rice stretched a cheap cut of pork into a meal that could feed an entire family for less than a quarter. Butchers often sold neck bones for pennies per pound, considering them scraps rather than proper meat, but African American cooks knew better. Simmered for hours with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and plenty of salt and pepper, the bones released collagen and flavor into rich broth, while meat felt tender from the bone. Served over rice that absorbed all that savory liquid, the dish became deeply satisfying despite humble origins. During the 1940s, when ration books limited meat purchases, neck bones provided the illusion of abundance. The bones looked impressive, piled on plates, the rice glistened with broth, and the flavor rivaled expensive cuts. Children learned to navigate the bones, finding every morsel hidden in crevices. This was Sunday dinner for families who couldn't afford roasts, and it was just as beloved.
Grits with red-eye gravy was the kind of breakfast that fueled families through cold mornings and long days of work or school. Grits were inexpensive and cooked into a smooth, warm base that filled the kitchen with a comforting smell. Meanwhile, mothers made red-eye gravy by deglazing a skillet of fat scraps with hot coffee, creating a thin, salty, smoky sauce that tasted far bigger than its ingredients suggested. The gravy soaked into the grits, giving them a sharp, invigorating flavor that woke everyone up instantly. Children ate it quickly, spooning it up while it was still warm enough to fog their breath. It was a breakfast that stuck to the ribs and kept bellies full until lunchtime. Even when the pantry was nearly empty, a pot of grits and a splash of coffee meant nobody went hungry. Mothers relied on this breakfast because it required almost nothing but offered so much: warmth, fullness, and enough energy to face whatever the day might bring. Many children remembered the smell long after leaving home, the scent of hot coffee hitting the skillet turning into a signal that it was time to get ready for work or school. It was a dish that said, without words, "You have something to stand on today." Grits with red-eye gravy was survival with a kick of courage. Homemade vinegar stored in bottles was one of the most useful items in a Depression-era kitchen. Made by fermenting leftover fruit scraps, peels, or even water and sugar, it cost almost nothing but gave families the ability to preserve vegetables, season greens, brighten stews, and even clean their homes. Vinegar's sharp tang lifted bland meals, made pickling possible, and helped stretch produce much longer than it would otherwise last. Families kept bottles tucked away in dark corners ready whenever a jar needed filling. It added flavor when spices were limited and helped meals feel fresher even after days of eating the same ingredients. Homemade vinegar was a tool of survival shaped from scraps, proof that even waste could become something valuable. It was a small miracle in a bottle, transforming ordinary vegetables into jars of vibrancy that lasted through long winters. Children often remembered the sour smell drifting through the kitchen as jars sealed with soft pops. Vinegar also served as medicine, cleaning agent, and food preserver all at once, making it one of the most versatile things a family could keep on hand. Garden pepper. Vinegar sauce was a condiment that cost almost nothing, yet transformed countless meals into something bright and bold. Families would fill bottles with vinegar and fresh garden peppers, letting the flavors steep until the liquid carried heat and tang. A dash of this sauce over collard greens, beans, or rice made even the plainest dish come alive. It was the kind of recipe that stretched beyond food, symbolizing self-reliance and the power of small comforts during hard times. Pepper vinegar was easy to make, requiring little more than patience and a garden harvest, which made it accessible to poor families during segregation. Its presence on the table brought pride, showing that flavor and ingenuity mattered as much as abundance. Children often remembered it as the bottle that sat at the center of meals, always within reach to spark bland plates into something flavorful. Garden pepper vinegar sauce proved that survival was not just about eating, but about savoring life. Fried rice cakes with molasses drizzle were the small joy at the end of a long week. Leftover rice, pressed into rounds and fried golden in sizzling fat, turned crisp outside and soft inside like pancakes for the patient. Once stacked, they were drizzled with molasses, the dark syrup pooling between edges and soaking through the cracks. For children, it was the sweetest thing they knew, eaten with fingers sticky and laughter loud. Grown folks called it supper when cupboards ran empty, proof that a treat could still fill a stomach. The crackle of frying rice sounded like home, simple, rhythmic, reassuring. It was the sound of making something out of nothing and smiling through it anyway. Fried rice cakes with molasses drizzle turned leftovers into love and hardship into a kind of celebration. They were proof that sweetness was never out of reach as long as imagination stayed alive. Cowpea stew with okra was more than a filling dinner. It was a direct link to West African cooking traditions that had crossed the ocean and endured through generations. In the kitchens of the Civil Rights era, this dish was a reminder of heritage and a way to feed many with what was available. Dried cowpeas, often bought in bulk for a low price, would be soaked and then simmered with okra until everything melded into a thick, hearty pot. Seasonings were simple but bold: garlic, onions, and a pinch of red pepper for heat. Some cooks added a ham hock or a bit of salt pork when they could, but even without meat, it was rich in flavor. The okra thickened the broth naturally, creating a stew that clung to cornbread or rice. It was the kind of meal that could be reheated for days, stretching every bit of food and labor. Around the table, families shared not just sustenance, but the comfort of knowing they were continuing something older than struggle itself. It was the taste of endurance, a dish that spoke softly of survival while feeding the body enough to face another day of work and fight. Corn fritters with syrup were the kind of dish that brought joy even in the hardest seasons. Cornmeal and kernels were mixed into a batter, fried in hot fat, and turned into golden cakes that crisped on the outside while staying soft within. These fritters could be eaten plain, but a drizzle of sorghum or molasses turned them into something sweet and memorable. Housewives served them as breakfast before a long day of work, or as supper when pantries were nearly bare. Children especially loved them because even the smallest taste of sweetness made ordinary meals feel special. Corn was cheap and plentiful, which meant fritters could be made often without straining a family's budget. They were filling, portable, and easy to cook in large batches, making them a dependable meal for both workdays and school days. In kitchens where survival was the daily goal, corn fritters with syrup proved that comfort and sustenance could still walk hand in hand.
Number 16, pig feet stew. If your grandmother cooked pig feet, you knew them by the smell before you walked through the door. A pig foot cost almost nothing because white America considered it waste, but simmered for 4 hours with onions, vinegar, salt, and red pepper flakes, those feet released enough collagen to turn the broth into a rich, gelatinous stew that stuck to your ribs and did not let go. In black neighborhoods across Memphis, Atlanta, and New Orleans, pig feet sat in glass jars on the counters of corner stores and barbershops. For families surviving on sharecropper wages, pig feet were one of the few animal proteins you could afford regularly. A woman who grew up in Macon, Georgia in the 1940s remembered her grandmother buying 6 pig feet every Saturday for a quarter and making a stew that lasted until Wednesday. 40 years later, that smell still meant Saturday to her. The feet that were meant to be thrown away became the foundation of your weekly ritual. Clabber biscuits were born from milk that had soured naturally, transformed from potential waste into tender, tangy bread. Black families without refrigeration let fresh milk sit until it thickened into clabber, a cultured product similar to buttermilk that made biscuits rise beautifully. The acidic clabber reacted with baking soda to create light, fluffy biscuits from the cheapest flour and fat available. These biscuits were served hot from cast iron skillets, split open and filled with whatever was on hand, whether sorghum, gravy, or a thin slice of salt pork. Nothing was wasted in kitchens where clabber biscuits appeared, the soured milk becoming the foundation for breakfasts that fed large families. Children learned to appreciate the subtle tang that clabber gave to bread. This technique turned spoilage into culinary advantage. Number 21, fatback and onion sandwich. Fatback was the cheapest cut a black butcher in the South sold by weight in the 1920s, and it traveled like leather. Porters' wives fried it slow until the strips curled into amber ribbons, then layered them with raw onion between 2 slices of bakery bread, bought day old for half price. The sandwich was wrapped in a single sheet of newsprint and pressed under a tin lid to flatten the bread into the meat. By the time the porter sat down on the steps of the baggage car to eat it, the onion had bitten into the fat and the whole thing tasted like Sunday morning at a kitchen table in Tuskegee. It was a meal his father had eaten, his grandfather too. The train just carried it further than it had ever gone before. Ash cakes were among the oldest breads in African American cooking, dating back to enslavement when ovens were unavailable. The recipe required only cornmeal, water, and salt mixed into stiff dough. This dough was shaped into flat rounds, wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves, and buried in hot ashes. The leaves protected the bread while allowing heat to cook it slowly. After 20 minutes, the cakes emerged with smoky flavor and dense texture. During the 1920s, families without reliable stoves still turned to this ancient method. The technique required no equipment, just fire and patience. Children watched grandmothers make ash cakes, learning skills connecting them to ancestors who cooked this bread under harsher conditions. Ash cakes were survival, transformed into something warm and nourishing. Sweet potato pone was the Depression-era dessert that graced Black Christmas tables when eggs, butter, and refined sugar were luxuries beyond reach. Grated raw sweet potatoes were mixed with molasses, a little flour, and whatever spices the pantry held, cinnamon, nutmeg, or ginger, then baked slowly until set into a dense, sticky confection. The natural sugars caramelized during baking, creating edges that turned almost candy-like, while the center stayed soft and pudding thick. The dish required no eggs and minimal fat, making it possible even for the poorest families to serve something sweet on Christmas morning. Children scraped the pan clean, savoring every bit of the molasses dark sweetness that lingered on the tongue. Sweet potato pone connected families to older traditions, to a time when African American cooks first learned to transform humble root vegetables into celebration. The dish carried forward wisdom that sweetness could be found without wealth, that Christmas dessert was possible for everyone.
Pig feet and collard greens brought together two ingredients that white society dismissed, but Black communities transformed into soul-satisfying meals. Pig feet, boiled until tender and gelatinous, released collagen that thickened cooking liquid into rich, silky broth. Collard greens, tough and bitter when raw, simmered in that broth for hours until they turned tender and deeply flavored. The combination created a pot of food that could feed 8 people for under 50 cents during Depression years. Black cooks added vinegar and hot peppers to cut through the richness, creating layers of flavor that made each bite interesting despite simple ingredients. In sharecropping communities, this dish appeared regularly because both ingredients were readily available. Pigs provided feet even when better cuts went to landowners, and collards grew abundantly in gardens. The pot liquor left behind was considered as valuable as the greens themselves, sopped up with cornbread or saved for cooking rice. Children learned to appreciate pig feet's unique texture, the meat slipping off bones and the skin turning silky after long cooking despite crushing poverty.
Pot liquor soup was the ultimate waste-nothing creation that turned cooking liquid into a meal unto itself. After collard greens or turnip greens simmered for hours with ham hocks or fatback, the resulting broth, pot liquor, became too precious to pour down any drain. African American families served this vitamin-rich broth in bowls with crumbled cornbread stirred in, creating a simple soup both filling and nourishing. The broth carried all the nutrients leached from greens during cooking, plus the smoky richness of whatever pork had flavored the pot. During wartime rationing, when fresh vegetables were precious, pot liquor provided essential nutrition that kept families healthy. Elders prescribed it for colds, weakness, and malaise, understanding instinctively what science would later confirm about its value. Children might not have loved the taste, but they grew strong on it nonetheless. Pot liquor soup proved that African American cooking wasted nothing and honored every ingredient.
Collard greens with salt pork were a staple because greens grew cheaply, lasted through cool seasons, and could turn into a full meal when paired with even a small square of salted pork. Mothers washed each leaf carefully, removing grit and stems, then chopped the greens into pieces that wilted beautifully in a simmering pot. The salt pork, often nothing more than a strip of fat with a thin edge of meat, was added for flavor, melting slowly into the broth and transforming the dish into something rich and savory. The greens cooked for hours until they softened and absorbed every bit of seasoning. Children often asked when they would be ready because the smell filled the whole house long before dinner time. When served with cornbread, the greens became a full meal, providing nutrients and warmth in every bite. Mothers loved this dish because it was inexpensive but powerful, feeding bodies and spirits during long, difficult seasons. Collard greens with salt pork were the definition of stretching little into enough. Evaporated milk cans were the quiet lifesavers that sat in pantries for months without spoiling. Families used them in coffee, mashed potatoes, soups, breads, and especially desserts when fresh dairy was out of reach. The thick, creamy texture made every dish feel richer than the ingredients actually allowed. Sometimes kids took a tiny sip straight from the can, savoring sweetness they seldom tasted. One can could transform a meal. It stretched sauces, softened custards, and held together recipes that would have fallen apart otherwise. During the Depression, evaporated milk was more than a convenience. It was survival disguised as luxury. It allowed families to recreate dishes they remembered from better times, even when money was scarce and ingredients were limited. Its shelf life made it a pantry staple that brought comfort through winter storms, long workdays, and nights when meals needed something special. In many homes, evaporated milk was the ingredient that made food feel complete, turning simple meals into something worth gathering around. Stewed cowtail, later known as oxtail, was a cut often overlooked by others, but cherished in African American kitchens for its ability to create deeply flavorful meals. Though it was tough and gelatin-rich, slow simmering transformed it into tender meat surrounded by rich, silky gravy. Families would stretch it further with potatoes, onions, carrots, and beans, ensuring that one pot could feed everyone at the table. Served over rice or with cornbread, it became a complete and filling supper. Cowtail stew reflected resilience as it turned what others considered scraps into something hearty and sustaining. It carried cultural ties as well, echoing African and Caribbean traditions where no part of the animal was wasted. This dish spoke to both thrift and heritage, providing comfort through both flavor and memory. For many families, stewed cowtail was survival in a pot, proof that with time, patience, and creativity, even the humblest cut could carry dignity. Mustard green chowder was the kind of soup that filled the air before it filled the bowl. It began with bacon ends and onions cooked down until the scent turned smoky and sweet. Then handfuls of chopped mustard greens were stirred in to simmer slowly. No cream, no fancy stock, just patience and a steady hand. The greens softened, giving the broth a peppery bite and a deep, earthy color. It was simple food, yet it carried layers of flavor that comforted tired families. Served with a wedge of cornbread or poured over rice, it was as rich as anything served in fine restaurants. The taste was bold but kind, a spoonful of history that reminded people they could still find warmth even when money was thin. Mustard green chowder was thrift turned into nourishment, a pot full of pride and resourcefulness. Molasses glazed carrots and onions brought sweetness to supper when sugar was hard to come by. Grandmothers simmered sliced onions and carrots together in a skillet, then stirred in a spoon of dark molasses until everything shone with a sticky brown glaze. The smell alone made the house feel like Sunday afternoon even in the middle of the week. The molasses clung to the vegetables, giving them a rich, smoky sweetness that balanced their earthiness. It was the kind of side dish that needed no main course, just an appetite and a little gratitude. When sugar ran out, molasses became magic, stretching across biscuits, beans, and vegetables alike. This dish tasted like memory, slow, deep, and honest. It reminded people that hardship could still carry comfort if you knew where to look. Molasses glazed carrots and onions were not just a side. They were a statement that Southern kitchens never stopped finding sweetness even in the darkest times. Ash-roasted sweet potatoes were the kind of rustic comfort food that required no fancy tools, just a warm hearth. Whole sweet potatoes, unpeeled, were nestled into the hot ashes of a wood-burning fireplace or stove where the heat baked them slowly from the inside out. As they cooked, their natural sugars caramelized, giving them a deep, honey-like sweetness. Once tender, they were pulled from the ashes, brushed clean, split open, and eaten steaming hot, sometimes with a pat of butter or sprinkle of salt. The method required patience but no special ingredients, making it perfect for families with limited resources. During the Civil Rights era, when electricity and modern ovens were not always available in rural areas, this technique kept a connection to older traditions. Sweet potatoes roasted this way were often eaten as a snack on cold days. their warmth and sweetness offering simple comfort. It was proof that good food did not need gadgets, just fire, patience, and a little time. Dried apple hand pies were a way to carry both sweetness and energy into the fields or on the road, showing the clever use of preserved fruit. Apples were often dried to last through winter, and housewives folded them into simple dough to make small hand pies. These pies were portable, filling, and could be made in large batches when fruit was available. Sweetened with a little sugar or molasses if possible, they offered a treat that brightened hard days. Workers carried them wrapped in cloth, eating them cold during breaks from labor. Children took them to school as a rare snack. They kept well, meaning nothing went to waste, and families had food ready when hunger struck. Though they seem modest now, dried apple hand pies carried a sense of pride for families who made the most of what little they had. They were survival food with a touch of sweetness, proving that even in struggle, comfort was possible.
Number 14, streak-o-lean and beans. Streak-o-lean was a cut of salt-cured pork belly with thin ribbons of meat running through the fat, cheaper even than bacon. You sliced it thin, fried it until crisp, and served it alongside a pot of pinto beans that had been simmering all day. In the 1930s, streak-o-lean sold for 8 cents a pound. Dried pinto beans cost a nickel. For 13 cents, a mother could feed a family of 6 a hot supper that stuck with you until morning. Her children did not know it was a poverty meal. They thought it was just what Monday tasted like. When your family talks about the meals they miss, they are not missing the ingredients. They are missing the person who made 13 cents feel like enough. Here is what the sharecropping system did to Black families that you need to understand. It did not just limit what you could eat, it controlled what you could grow. Plantation owners required sharecroppers to plant cotton and nothing else. If you planted a garden, you risked losing your tenancy. If you raised chickens without permission, the landowner could take them. The system was designed to make your family dependent on the commissary store, where prices were double what they charged in town, and every purchase was added to a debt that never shrank. That is why these meals are so narrow. Not because Black families lack creativity, because the system restricted your options to the space between what was allowed and what was needed. Hoghead cheese was a jellied meat dish that transformed the least desirable parts of a pig into a cold cut that lasted for weeks. Black families simmered the entire hog head along with feet and other scraps until the meat fell from the bone and the liquid became rich with natural gelatin. The meat was chopped, seasoned with vinegar, pepper, and herbs, then packed into molds where it set into a firm loaf as it cooled. Sliced thin and eaten cold on bread or crackers, hoghead cheese provided protein that required no refrigeration beyond a cool cellar. This dish represented the ultimate expression of nose-to-tail eating, honoring the animal by using every part. Families made it during hog killing season, stretching a single pig into months of meals. The tangy, savory slices became a staple at breakfast tables and in packed lunches. Number 23, smoked sausage and cold grits. Smoked sausage was the porter's protein when payday was still 6 days away. Black butchers in St. Louis and Memphis sold links for around 12 cents a piece in the early 1930s, and a porter's wife would pan fry 2 of them on Saturday night, let them cool, and slide them into the tin pail beside a small enamel cup of stiff grits. The grits set up overnight in the icebox and traveled like a brick, eaten cold with the spoon while the train climbed the grade out of Birmingham. By the time the porter reached the second leg of his run, the sausage had bled its grease into the grits and the meal was warm in the mouth, even though it was cold in the cup. It was poor food made smart. 3 working hours of food for the price of a streetcar fare. Pickled pigs' feet were testament to preservation and refusing to waste any part of the hog. After butchering, the feet were cleaned, boiled until tender, then packed into crocks with spiced vinegar, bay leaves, and peppercorns. The pickling preserved them for months without refrigeration, providing protein whenever needed. The texture was gelatinous, the meat tender against soft cartilage surrounding each bone. Black families ate them cold from the jar as snack or alongside other dishes. The vinegar's tang cut through richness, making them surprisingly refreshing. Children often found them strange at first, but grew to crave that combination of textures. Pickled pig's feet appeared at gatherings and holidays, pulled from pantries where they had been waiting. They represented foresight, preparing today for tomorrow's hunger. Crackling bread brought Christmas morning joy to 1930s Black households by transforming porkskin scraps into golden cornbread studded with crispy treasures. After rendering lard from fatback, women saved the brown, crunchy bits of skin that remained in the pot. These cracklings were folded into cornmeal batter along with buttermilk and a touch of salt, then baked in cast iron until the bread developed a crackling crust of its own. Each bite delivered both the earthiness of corn and bursts of salty, porky crunch that made children fight for corner pieces. The bread cost nothing extra since cracklings were simply a byproduct of making lard, which every family did after fall hog killing. Served hot with molasses or alongside Christmas dinner greens, crackling bread elevated simple cornbread into something worth celebrating. The dish represented the wisdom of using every part of what you had, turning waste into wonder through knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters across generations.
Dried pinto beans were one of the first things families stocked up on because they lasted forever, filled bellies fast, and cost next to nothing during a time when every penny mattered. These beans sat quietly in cloth sacks or glass jars on pantry shelves, waiting to turn into something warm and sustaining after long days of trying to get by. Pinto beans did not need much, just water, a little heat, and maybe a scrap of fatback if the kitchen was lucky that week. They simmered slow, softening into a thick pot of comfort that could stretch across several meals, sometimes feeding large families for days. Kids grew up recognizing the familiar smell drifting from the stove, a sign that dinner was going to be simple but steady, the kind of food that kept people moving through hard winters and harder workdays. Pinto beans were survival food, but they were also memory food, tying families together with the quiet understanding that something small and humble could carry you through. They were a backbone ingredient in countless homes because they worked every time, no matter how thin the pantry looked. Dried pinto beans did not just feed families, they steadied them.
Red beans and rice became Monday tradition in African American households, a dish that simmered all day while families tackled the week's heaviest chores. Dried red beans were soaked overnight, then slow cooked with whatever seasoning meat was available, ham hocks, salt pork, or even just the bone from Sunday's dinner. Onions, garlic, and bay leaves joined the pot as the beans bubbled into creamy richness over hours of patient cooking. The dish was ladled over rice that absorbed the thick, savory liquid until every grain glistened. During the 1940s, when meat rationing made protein scarce, red beans and rice provided complete nutrition for pennies. The combination of legumes and grain created protein as complete as any meat, a fact that African American cooks understood instinctively. Children ate hearty portions on Tuesday mornings, fueled by leftovers that tasted even better the second day. This was working class food, connecting wartime families to ancestors who survived on the same humble combination.
Crackling cornbread was a rich, hearty version of cornbread made with leftover pork cracklings that added flavor and calories to an otherwise simple dish. Mothers mixed the cracklings into the batter, folding them in until each scoop promised a bit of salty crunch. As the cornbread baked, the smell filled the house, making children eager for the first hot slice. The cracklings gave every bite texture and depth, turning ordinary cornbread into something more sustaining. Served with beans, greens, or simply on its own, crackling cornbread helped families stay full through long evenings. Children especially loved the crispy edges where the cracklings peeked through. Mothers relied on it during the cold months because it paired well with almost anything and always lasted until the next day. It was resourcefulness turned into tradition. Sorghum syrup bottles sat on shelves like dark liquid treasure, thick, sweet, and impossible to waste. This syrup-flavored biscuits drizzled over cornbread, stirred into porridges, and even served as a home remedy for sore throats or coughs. Sorghum lasted far longer than sugar and cost much less, making it a depression staple in African American homes. Kids loved dipping biscuits into the bottle's sticky mouth, and elders praised its strength for keeping people going when meals were bare. A single bottle could stretch across weeks, sweetening life in small but powerful ways. Sorghum syrup was flavor, medicine, and comfort wrapped into one. During winters when fruits were scarce and treats rare, sorghum made plain food feel indulgent. Its deep, earthy sweetness reminded families that even the simplest pantry items could bring warmth, energy, and a sense of steady, grounded survival. Many households kept it close at hand, using it sparingly but lovingly. Knowing that this humble syrup carried generations of tradition, sorghum was the kind of ingredient that hardened people against hunger and softened the edges of hard days, proving sweetness could survive even the toughest times. Rice bread was an ingenious way to bulk up loaves when wheat flour was too costly or scarce, stretching staple grains into something filling and versatile. Families mixed leftover cooked rice into bread dough, creating a moist, tender loaf that could be eaten with meals or on its own. It was an economical solution, ensuring that nothing went to waste and that rice, already an essential food, could serve double duty. In African American households during segregation, this kind of innovation was survival, proving that thrift did not have to mean going without. Rice bread carried a unique flavor and texture that made it beloved, especially when paired with stews or soups that needed something sturdy to sop them up. It reflected both ingenuity and necessity, transforming the ordinary into something sustaining. For children, it often meant having bread for school lunches when money was tight, while adults valued the way it kept families fed. Rice bread was survival baked into every slice. Rice and egg gravy made the poor man feel rich and the weary feel full again. Eggs were beaten into hot milk and drippings, thickened slowly over a wood stove until the mixture turned smooth, glossy, and golden as dawn. The smell drifted through small homes, wrapping everyone in the comfort of something familiar and kind. There was no meat in it, but somehow it carried the depth and warmth of a feast, the buttery flavor coating every spoonful like quiet reassurance. Each bite felt heavier than it should have, not from the ingredients, but from the love that went into making it. The rice soaked up the gravy, turning plain grains into a meal that could fill a house with gratitude. It was passed around in one bowl, steaming and steady, feeding hands that worked hard and hearts that needed hope. Rice and egg gravy was more than thrift. It was proof that even in the leanest times, creativity turned scarcity into satisfaction. It taught that survival could taste gentle, that a humble kitchen could hold abundance without excess. Every spoonful carried the story of endurance and care, a reminder that simple food could still taste like grace. Sorghum molasses. Cookies were a sweet that tasted like home even when times were hard. Sorghum syrup, thick and deep brown, was cheaper than refined sugar and had been used for generations in African American kitchens. During the Civil Rights era, it was a pantry staple that stretched far, sweetening biscuits, bread, and especially cookies. The dough was made with flour, baking soda, warm spices like cinnamon and ginger, a bit of fat such as lard or shortening, and enough sorghum to give it a rich, earthy sweetness. Once baked, the cookies came out soft and chewy, with a subtle spice that lingered on the tongue. They were easy to make in big batches, perfect for church gatherings, neighborhood meetings, or simply to have on hand for children after school. Sorghum cookies traveled well too, tucked into lunch pails or wrapped in wax paper for marches and long days away from home. They were a taste of comfort in moments that often carried uncertainty and struggle. More than a treat, they were a reminder that joy could be baked into even the leanest kitchens, and that a little sweetness could go a long way in sustaining both body and spirit. Hog liver pudding was one of the many dishes that used organ meat because nothing could ever go to waste when feeding a large family on little money. Liver was cheap and often overlooked, but it carried dense nutrition. Housewives would grind it and mix it with cornmeal, onions, and spices before baking it into a savory pudding. The dish sat firm and sliced like bread, meaning it could be served hot at dinner or cold in sandwiches the next day. It stretched a small piece of meat into something that could feed many mouths. The flavor was strong, but seasoning with pepper and herbs helped balance it. For those who grew up on it, hog liver pudding was a reminder of both hardship and care because it kept families healthy during tough times. It was not about luxury, it was about survival, and housewives made sure it served that purpose well.
Number 9, sardines and crackers. A tin of sardines cost a nickel in the 1940s. A sleeve of saltines cost a few cents more. Together, they made the fastest, cheapest meal you could carry into a factory or a cotton field. You opened the tin, laid the sardines on the crackers, and ate standing up. For black men working double shifts in northern steel mills during the Great Migration, sardines and crackers was lunch, sometimes dinner, sometimes both. In the Jim Crow South, black travelers carried tins of sardines because restaurants refused to serve you and rest stops closed their doors. A generation of black children grew up watching their fathers eat sardines over the kitchen sink after a 12-hour shift. It was not a memory of poverty. It was a memory of a man too tired to sit down, but too stubborn to skip a meal. Here is something about the Great Migration that changes how you understand every meal on this list. Between 1916 and 1970, 6 million black Americans left the South. They left because Jim Crow made life unbearable. They left because sharecropping was a debt trap disguised as farming. But when they arrived in Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, the food was different. The cornmeal was degerminated, stripped of flavor. The pork came wrapped in plastic, and the prices were higher than anything you had paid in Mississippi. So your family adapted. They found the cheapest cuts at unfamiliar butcher shops. They grew collards in window boxes. They carried recipes in their heads across 800 miles and cooked them in kitchens the size of closets. Every meal that survived the migration did so because someone refused to let it die. Not because it was easy to find the right cornmeal or the right cut of pork in a northern city that did not understand your food. Because giving up the food meant giving up the last thread connecting your kitchen to the one your mother kept 800 miles south. That thread was thin, but it held. And for 6 million people, that thread was the difference between a new city that felt like a home and a new city that felt like an exile. The meals survived because the people who made them decided that home was not a place. Home was a pot on the stove. Bone marrow spread turned the insides of discarded bones into a rich, buttery topping that elevated plain bread into something special. Black families roasted large beef or pork bones until the marrow softened, then scooped out the creamy centers and spread them on cornbread or biscuits while still warm. The marrow had a silky texture and deep, meaty flavor that cost nothing since butchers gave away bones. This spread provided essential fats and nutrients when butter was unaffordable and meat was reserved for Sunday. Children watched as mothers cracked bones and extracted every bit of marrow, learning that valuable food often hid inside what others threw away. The spread was sometimes mixed with salt and herbs, stretched further across more bread. Bone marrow represented the ultimate no-waste philosophy of survival cooking. Number 19, pinto beans with a smoked neck bone. Pinto beans were the cheapest dried bean in a black neighborhood grocery in 1934, running about 6 cents a pound. Porters' wives soaked them overnight, simmered them all day with a smoked pork neck bone, and ladled a thick portion into a small lidded crock that fit at the bottom of the tin pail. The neck bone gave up its meat slowly through the run, and by the second reheat, the broth had thickened into something close to gravy. Porters ate it cold or warm, depending on the stove access, scooping it with cornbread instead of a spoon. It was a meal designed by women who knew exactly how long a man would be away from a kitchen. Fried salt pork was everyday protein for black families who could not afford fresh meat regularly. Pork belly was cured in heavy salt and stored in barrels, ready to be sliced whenever needed. The slices were soaked to remove excess salt, then fried in their own fat until edges crisped and meat turned golden. Served alongside grits, eggs, or bread, fried salt pork delivered satisfying flavor, making plain meals feel complete. The rendered fat was never wasted, save for cooking vegetables or gravy. Salt pork required no refrigeration, essential for families without ice boxes. A single barrel lasted months, providing protein through seasons when hunting was poor or gardens dormant. Children grew up with this taste as foundation of countless meals, its richness becoming the flavor of home. Hog's head cheese appeared on Christmas sideboards across black households in the 1930s, transforming the least desirable parts of the pig into a cold-cut rivaling any store-bought meat. After the fall hog killing, women simmered the head for hours until meat fell from the bone, then picked every usable scrap: cheeks, snout, ears, and tongue. The meat was chopped fine, seasoned with sage, black pepper, and vinegar, then pressed into loaf pans where natural gelatin set it firm overnight. Sliced thin and served cold, hog's head cheese offered protein, lasting through the holidays without refrigeration. The dish cost nothing beyond salt and spices, since families used parts that would otherwise go to waste. Children spread it on cornbread, not knowing they were eating the wisdom of generations who refused to let anything go unused. Hog's head cheese represented the philosophy sustaining black families through slavery, Reconstruction, and Depression. Waste nothing, honor everything, find richness where others see only scraps.
Peanut soup demonstrated the brilliance of using locally grown legumes to create filling, nutritious meals from almost nothing. Peanuts, grown throughout the South and often harvested by black farmers, were ground into paste and mixed with water, onions, and whatever seasonings could be found. The mixture cooked down into creamy soup that provided protein, fat, and comfort. This wasn't the refined peanut butter soup found in fancy cookbooks. It was rough, grainy, and honest, tasting of earth and survival. Black families made peanut soup regularly because peanuts stored well and could be ground by hand using simple tools. The soup filled hungry children before school and warmed field workers who came home exhausted after dark. In Alabama and Georgia, where peanuts were staple crops, this soup appeared so frequently it became associated with Depression hardship. Yet it delivered genuine nutrition. Peanuts provided complete protein and essential fats that kept bodies functioning during starvation conditions with community support.
Fried cabbage with fatback was a one-pot meal that sustained African American families when gardens provided abundance, but grocery money remained scarce. Cabbage grew easily in southern soil, producing large heads that could feed families for days when prepared with skill. Cooks rendered slices of salted fatback in cast iron until crispy, then added shredded cabbage to the sizzling fat, stirring until the leaves wilted and absorbed smoky, salty pork flavor. Onions and pepper joined the pot, and everything simmered until the cabbage turned silky and sweet. The dish required no expensive ingredients, just a vegetable costing pennies per pound and a small piece of preserved pork that stretched across multiple meals. During wartime, when fresh meat was limited by ration books, fatback became even more valuable as flavoring rather than main course. Children learned to love cabbage caramelized at the edges while staying tender inside. This was poverty food that never tasted poor.
Fried cornmeal mush was the kind of breakfast or dinner that stretched leftovers into something new. Leftover cornmeal mush was poured into a pan to chill overnight, becoming firm enough to slice. Mothers cut it into rectangles and fried them in a hot skillet until each piece turned golden and crisp on the outside. The inside stayed soft and warm, a perfect contrast in texture. Children topped the slices with syrup or butter if the house had any, but even plain, the cakes were filling and delicious. Some families sprinkled a little sugar on top, turning the meal into a treat. Others served it with greens or beans, making it part of a larger dinner. It was a meal built from yesterday's scraps, but enjoyed like something special. Fried cornmeal mush was proof that nothing needed to go to waste. Homemade jams from wild berries were the sweetest reward of summer for families who knew how to make the most out of whatever the land offered. Kids gathered blackberries, dewberries, and mulberries in buckets, fingers stained purple by the time they returned home. Grandmothers turned the fruit into jams that bubbled on the stove, thickened with sugar when it was available and stretched carefully when it was not. These jars carried the taste of warm months into cold, bleak winters. A spoonful on bread made a meal feel complete. Jams were a reminder that even hard times could still offer sweetness. Every jar was a quiet celebration of community labor, berry-picking trips, and afternoons spent stirring a pot that promised comfort in the cold months ahead. For families surviving the Depression, jam was more than food. It was proof that joy could be saved for later. Each jar represented foresight, love, and a determination to preserve not just fruit, but a sense of normalcy. When opened in winter, those jams brought color and hope to tables that often lacked both. Chitlins gravy over rice was a way of stretching a hard-earned delicacy further, turning humble leftovers into an entire meal. After chitlins were cleaned and cooked, families would use the broth and scraps to create a savory gravy that flavored bowls of rice. This was a clever way of ensuring nothing went to waste, especially when meat was rare and costly. Rice served as the backbone, cheap and filling, while the gravy added richness and depth that transformed plain grains into comfort food. For many African American families, it was proof that resourcefulness could turn scraps into sustenance. Chitlins gravy over rice carried both flavor and memory, tying meals to heritage and necessity. Children might not have known the origins of the dish, but they knew the satisfaction it brought at the table. It was food that spoke of endurance, pride, and creativity, turning what others might have discarded into survival. This meal showed that even the humblest combinations could carry strength. Potato peel pie came from kitchens that refused to let hunger win. Every saved peel was mashed with milk, onion, salt, and flour to make a filling that turned creamy once baked inside a crisp crust of leftover dough. It was a dish born from hands that knew how to stretch every harvest until there was nothing left to save. The smell of roasting potatoes drifted through small homes and fields, earthy and rich, the scent of supper and survival. No one thought it was strange to eat what others might throw away. They just called it dinner and thanked God for it. Potato peel pie was not fancy, but it held the taste of warmth and care in every bite. The browned edges crackled, the inside stayed soft, and the pie cooled slow on the windowsill like something precious. It was the very picture of Southern thrift, clever, kind, and stubborn in all the right ways. People did not just eat to live, they ate to remember who they were. Potato peel pie was comfort baked right into a crust, proof that love always found a way to feed a family. Cornmeal dumplings in collared pot liquor were a clever way to turn leftover cooking liquid into a meal. Pot liquor, the nutrient-rich broth left from boiling collard greens, was saved and reheated, often fortified with bits of ham or pork fat for extra flavor. Cornmeal dumplings, made from a simple mixture of cornmeal, flour, and water, were dropped into the simmering pot liquor and cooked until tender. The dumplings absorbed the smoky, savory flavors of the broth, making them both hearty and nourishing. During the Civil Rights era, nothing from the kitchen was wasted, and this dish was a prime example of that mindset. Collared pot liquor was already rich in vitamins and minerals, so turning it into a full meal was both practical and healthful. This dish was often served at midday, providing energy for the rest of the day's work. For many, it carried the taste of home gardens, shared labor, and the comfort of knowing that even scraps could be transformed into something worth savoring. Fried chitlins were never considered glamorous, but they held an honored place in survival cooking because they used parts of the hog that others ignored. The intestines had to be carefully cleaned and boiled for hours to make them safe and tender enough to eat. Once fried, they developed a crispy outside with a chewy inside, and when seasoned with spices or hot sauce, they became a meal that satisfied in more ways than one. This was not just about taste, but about necessity, because a family could not afford to waste a single part of an animal. Chitlins fed working men who needed protein, and they carried a cultural weight as well, since they connected African American kitchens with traditions carried from Africa. Families would gather to prepare them, turning the labor into a shared ritual. Though humble, fried chitlins reflected dignity, strength, and the will to survive on scraps that others threw away.
Number 22, neck bones and rice. Neck bones were the cut that nobody wanted. Butchers in black neighborhoods sold them for 10 to 15 cents a pound in the 1950s because there was almost no meat on them. But your grandmother with a heavy pot and 4 hours of patience could turn 2 pounds of neck bones into a meal that fed 6 people. Brown them first, add water, onion, garlic, salt, and pepper, and let the pot simmer until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned thick and dark with collagen. Served over white rice, it made your grandmother's kitchen smell like love and necessity in equal measure. Families who migrated to Chicago and Detroit brought this recipe north and cooked it in apartments where the only southern thing left was the cast iron and the knowledge of what to do with a cheap cut of bone. The meat was almost nothing. The broth was everything. Streak-o-lean was the poor man's bacon, a cheap cut of pork belly with thin streaks of meat running through solid fat that cost pennies when proper bacon was beyond reach. Black families fried these thin slices until the fat rendered and meat crisped, creating a breakfast staple that filled bellies and provided energy for grueling workdays. The rendered fat was saved for cooking vegetables, frying eggs, or seasoning beans, making every slice work double duty. This cut appeared at breakfast tables across the South, sizzling in cast iron alongside eggs and grits, filling kitchens with the smell of pork. Though wealthier families looked down on this fatty cut, Black households understood its value. The fat provided essential calories during scarcity, and the small amount of meat satisfied cravings when ham was unaffordable. Number 18, apple hand pies, sold to porters at division stops. Black women along the route ran small kitchens near the rail yards in towns like Greenwood and Vicksburg, and they sold apple hand pies wrapped in newsprint for a nickel apiece. The dough was rendered lard and flour. The filling was windfall apples cooked down with brown sugar. Porters bought them through the open Dutch door during the 5-minute stop, dropping the coin into a calloused hand and tucking the warm pie inside the tin pail beside the cold meal already there. Some women ran the same stand for 30 years and put their children through school on those nickels. The pie was eaten by lantern light an hour later, the crust shattering down the porter's lapel. A black economy ran alongside the Pullman line, and almost nobody outside it ever saw the books. Black-eyed pea soup stretched a handful of dried peas into enough food to feed a crowd. The peas were sorted, soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with ham hocks, onions, and available seasonings. As they cooked, peas softened and released starch, thickening broth into something between soup and stew. Some families added greens or tomatoes, while others kept it simple, letting smoky pork and earthy peas carry flavor. The soup was ladled over rice or cornbread, creating complete protein at minimal cost. Black-eyed peas grew well in southern soil, and families raised their own, drying them for winter. The dish carried cultural significance associated with good luck on New Year's Day. Black-eyed pea soup represented hope and resilience, nourishing body and spirit. Collard greens, simmered with ham hocks, became the essential Christmas side dish in 1930s Black households, cooking low and slow while filling homes with the promise of holiday feasting. Women would strip tough stems from bundles of greens grown in backyard gardens or forage from neighbors who had extra. The greens went into massive pots with smoked ham hocks, often the only pork a family could afford, along with onions, vinegar, and hot pepper for heat. They simmered for hours until the greens turned silky and dark, soaking up the smoky richness of the pork while the ham hocks fell apart tender. The cooking liquid, called pot liquor, was saved and sipped with cornbread or given to children as a tonic. Greens symbolized money and prosperity for the coming year, making them essential for Christmas dinner regardless of what else might be missing. Every pot told the story of survival, of women who knew how to coax flavor from tough leaves and make a single ham hock stretch to feed a crowd.
Pan-fried corn was sunshine in a skillet, sweet, buttery, and golden. Fresh ears were scraped by hand, milk and all, then tossed into hot bacon grease until the kernels popped and sizzled. A sprinkle of salt, a dash of sugar, maybe a touch of pepper. It didn't need much else. The smell filled the kitchen, calling everyone to gather round. Each spoonful had that mix of sweet and savory that only Southern cooks could master. It was summer food, made from corn grown nearby, cooked while the day was still hot and bright. You could eat it by itself or scoop it beside greens and meat, but it always stole the show. The sound of it frying was like music, a melody of comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of dish that turned ordinary days into something to remember. Pan-fried corn was quick to make but impossible to forget, the kind of dish that reminded people that joy could fit inside a cast-iron skillet.
Sawmill gravy earned its name from lumber camps, where workers needed cheap, filling food to fuel back-breaking labor. African-American cooks perfected this dish using pan drippings, flour, milk or water, salt, and generous black pepper that gave the gravy its distinctive speckled appearance. The technique was simple but required skill, whisking constantly to prevent lumps while building flavor from whatever meat had been fried beforehand. Poured over biscuits, the gravy transformed plain bread into something substantial enough to carry a family through hours of work. During the 1940s, when meat was rationed and dairy sometimes scarce, sawmill gravy stretched resources brilliantly. A single pan of fried fatback could produce enough drippings for gravy that fed an entire family. The pepper wasn't just flavoring, it made the gravy seem more substantial and satisfying. This was working class food that acknowledged hardship while refusing to surrender to it.
Hog maw and potatoes was a dish rooted in tradition and necessity, using pork stomachs simmered long enough to become tender and flavorful. Mothers cleaned the hog maw carefully, then stewed it with onions, salt, pepper, and chunks of potatoes. The long cooking process softened everything into a heavy, sustaining pot that filled the kitchen with warmth. Children often approached the dish with caution at first, but the rich flavor and tender potatoes won them over. It was the kind of meal that carried families through cold nights and hard days. Many households learned the dish from older relatives who had relied on it long before the 1960s, passing down not just a recipe but a method of survival. The smell of the stew simmering created a sense of reassurance, a reminder that something warm and filling was waiting at the table. Hog maw and potatoes was history, hardship, and nourishment in one pot. cabbage fermented into slaws was a clever way families made vegetables last long past their growing season. When fresh cabbage was cheap and abundant, families shredded it, salted it, packed it into jars or crocks, and let time transform it into something tangy and crisp that held up through bitter winters. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage but added flavor and nutrients when meals were often plain and repetitive. During the Depression, when fresh greens disappeared quickly, having a jar of fermented slaw meant there was always something bright and sharp to cut through heavy dishes. It brought contrast to beans, cornbread, or stews, and made even the simplest supper feel complete. Kids might wrinkle their noses at the smell, but adults appreciated how far a single head of cabbage could be stretched. Cabbage slaw was survival with personality, tart, lively, and always ready to remind families that good food could still exist in hard times. Collard green stalk relish was a clever way to ensure that even the parts of greens often discarded found purpose in the kitchen. After cooking the leaves, families would save the stalks, chop them finely, and pickle them with vinegar, peppers, and spices. The result was a tangy, crunchy relish that could brighten meals of beans, rice, or cornbread. It represented a waste not, want not philosophy that was necessary for survival during segregation, when money and ingredients were scarce. Collard green stalk relish also carried flavor that balanced the heavier, fattier dishes often made with pork scraps. It was not just thrifty, but tasty, proving that creativity could elevate even the humblest ingredients. Families cherished it for its ability to keep meals varied and to add a spark of brightness to otherwise plain dinners. This relish became both a symbol of thrift and a celebration of ingenuity, showing how nothing was ever wasted in resilient kitchens. Cornmeal dumplings in ham broth were what turned a little pot of broth into a full meal. Bits of dough, made from cornmeal and water, were dropped into bubbling ham stock and left to swell and soften. They absorbed every bit of smoky salt and fat, turning light broth into thick comfort. The kitchen filled with the smell of ham and hearth, a scent that promised something steady. Served with greens or beans, it stretched one meal into two, proof that care could multiply food. Cornmeal dumplings in ham broth fed the tired, the young, and the hopeful alike, spoon by spoon. It was a dish that needed nothing more than a pot, a handful of meal, and patience. Three things Southern kitchens always had. Sweet rice pudding with raisins was the kind of dessert that turned scraps into something special. Leftover rice from supper would be mixed with milk, a bit of sugar or sorghum, and a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg. Raisins, when they could be afforded, were stirred in to plump up during baking, adding little bursts of sweetness in each bite. Some families used evaporated milk to make it creamier, while others relied on whatever dairy was on hand. The mixture was poured into a baking dish and cooked slowly until the top formed a gentle crust, while the inside stayed soft and custard-like. Served warm or cold, it was a treat that stretched simple pantry staples into something comforting enough to end a long day. During the Civil Rights era, it was common for rice pudding to be brought to church socials or community gatherings, where recipes were shared and adapted. For many, it carried memories of grandmothers standing over the stove, stirring patiently while telling stories of resilience. Sweet rice pudding was more than a way to use leftovers. It was proof that thrift and care could create something that fed both hunger and the soul.
Number 15, cold collard sandwiches packed leftover greens between bread for lunches that provided vitamins and fiber. Families cooked large batches of collards with smoked meat, then saved portions for next day's meals. The greens were squeezed to remove excess liquid, seasoned with hot sauce or vinegar, and spread between bread slices. The flavor was earthy and slightly bitter, the pot liquor having concentrated overnight. Workers carried these knowing the greens provided nutrition that bread alone could never offer. Children ate them without complaint because collards were familiar. The taste of Sunday dinner transformed into Monday lunch. The sandwiches traveled well because greens stayed flavorful cold. This lunch represented practical genius of stretching one meal into two ensuring that labor of cooking collards fed families multiple times. Couscous was a Creole cornmeal dish that stretched a handful of meal into a hearty breakfast for an entire family. Black cooks in Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast stirred cornmeal into a skillet with hot water, forming small lumps that fried until crispy on the outside while staying soft within. The dish was served swimming in milk or clabber, sometimes sweetened with cane syrup or eaten savory with crumbled bacon. The name itself came from West African languages, connecting this humble dish to ancestral cooking traditions that survived the Middle Passage. Couscous required minimal ingredients and cooked quickly over low heat, making it ideal for mornings when time and fuel were both precious. Children ate it before school, laborers carried it cold to the fields, and elders remembered it as the taste of home and heritage combined. Number 29, hoe cakes cooked on the vestibule stove. When the dining car shut for the night, porters slipped down to the coal stove that heated the vestibule and dropped a spoon of cornmeal batter onto the hot iron lid. Hoe cakes were field food brought north by their fathers from Mississippi and Alabama, and they cost almost nothing. A cup of meal, a pinch of soda, water from the porter's washroom tap. The smell carried into the sleeper berths, and white passengers would sometimes ask what was cooking. Porters always said nothing. By the time the train hit St. Louis, the hoe cakes were folded into a handkerchief and eaten standing up. They were the closest thing a working man had to home cooking between Chicago and New Orleans. Stewed rabbit was protein, costing nothing for families who knew how to trap or hunt. Throughout the rural South in the 1920s, rabbits were plentiful, and black families depended on them when store-bought meat was beyond reach. The rabbit was clean, jointed, and browned in rendered fat before simmering for hours with onions and herbs. Wild thyme and bay leaves lent earthy depth. Long cooking transformed tough wild rabbit into tender meat falling from bone. The broth thickened naturally, creating gravy clinging to every piece. Families served rabbit stew over rice or with biscuits to stretch one animal into multiple meals. Young boys learned to set snares, contributing while gaining skills passed through generations. Rabbit stew represented self-sufficiency and feeding family without cash. Chitlins held a sacred place at Christmas tables throughout black communities in the 1930s, representing survival and celebration during the Depression's darkest years. These pig intestines required hours of careful cleaning, scrubbing, and soaking in salt water and vinegar before cooking. Women would begin preparing them days before Christmas, the pungent smell filling homes and announcing the holiday to entire neighborhoods. The intestines were boiled slowly with onions, bay leaves, and hot peppers until tender, then fried crisp for Christmas dinner. The dish cost almost nothing since butchers gave away intestines or sold them for pennies. For black families who rarely afforded traditional holiday meats, chitlins transformed what others discarded into celebration. Children might not have understood the sacrifice, but elders knew every bite represented resourcefulness passed through generations. The aroma that once signaled poverty became the smell of Christmas, proof that dignity could rise from what the world threw away.
Cabbage fermented into slaws was a clever way families made vegetables last long past their growing season. When fresh cabbage was cheap and abundant, families shredded it, salted it, packed it into jars or crocks, and let time transform it into something tangy and crisp that held up through bitter winters. This fermentation not only preserved the cabbage but added flavor and nutrients when meals were often plain and repetitive. During the Depression, when fresh greens disappeared quickly, having a jar of fermented slaw meant there was always something bright and sharp to cut through heavy dishes. It brought contrast to beans, cornbread, or stews, and made even the simplest supper feel complete. Kids might wrinkle their noses at the smell, but adults appreciated how far a single head of cabbage could be stretched. Cabbage slaw was survival with personality. Tart, lively, and always ready to remind families that good food could still exist in hard times.
Hoppin' John carry luck and prosperity into African American households, especially when served on New Year's Day, but families ate it throughout the year because it was cheap and filling. Black-eyed peas were simmered with rice, onions, and whatever pork seasoning was available, bacon ends, ham hocks, or salt pork, until everything melded into a dish that was greater than its parts. The peas provided protein, the rice provided bulk, and the pork provided the rich, smoky flavor that made the dish worth eating. During the 1940s, when ration books limited meat purchases, Hoppin' John stretched a small amount of pork into a meal that fed entire families. Some served it with collard greens, believing the combination brought both luck and money in the coming year. The dish required minimal supervision, just time and a steady flame, freeing cooks for other work. Children ate it without complaint because the flavors were familiar and comforting. Hoppin' John was tradition, economy, and good eating combined.
Catfish head stew was a resourceful dish created when whole fillets were too expensive to buy. Fish heads, cheap but packed with flavor, were simmered with onions, celery, peppers, and seasonings until they infused the broth with richness. Mothers removed the bones carefully, leaving behind tender pieces of meat that melted into the stew. Potatoes or rice were added to stretch the meal further. The smell of the stew simmering filled the home, comforting and familiar. Children ate it eagerly, savoring each warm spoonful. Many families along southern rivers or coastal areas relied on this dish because fish heads were easy to come by, often sold for pennies or given away. The broth became milky and rich, carrying a depth that no one would expect from such humble beginnings. Catfish head stew was proof that even the parts overlooked by others could feed a family well. Sweet potatoes stored in root cellars were the insurance policy families trusted when money ran out and gardens froze over. Hardy, reliable, and versatile, sweet potatoes lasted for months underground, staying firm and flavorful even when everything else spoiled. Families roasted them, mashed them, fried them, turned them into pies, or sliced them into stews. Kids often ate them plain right out of the skin, warm and sweet like candy without the cost. They were comfort food and survival food rolled into 1A basket of sweet potatoes meant no one would go hungry, even during the hardest weeks. They were the kind of food elders talked about proudly, remembering how one harvest kept everyone fed. Sweet potatoes represented resilience, the kind passed down through generations. And because they grew well even in poor soil, they became a symbol of strength in communities that had to make abundance out of scarcity. Many families planned their winter meals around them, trusting that sweet potatoes would always hold their flavor and heartiness no matter how cold it got outside. In a world full of uncertainty, sweet potatoes stayed dependable, delicious, and deeply rooted in cultural memory. Cracklin' cornbread muffins were handheld bites of survival, made by folding pork cracklings into cornbread batter and baking them in tins. Cracklings were simply leftover bits of fried pork skin and fat, often saved after rendering lard. Adding them to cornbread turned a simple bread into a protein-rich, filling snack that could serve as both side and meal. For families struggling through segregation, muffins like these were portable, affordable, and deeply sustaining. They represented thrift at its best, showing how nothing from the pig was wasted. Children especially loved finding the crunchy, savory pieces inside, while adults valued the fullness it brought to the stomach. Cracklin' cornbread muffins tied directly to African American traditions of resourcefulness, blending thrift and flavor in every bite. They were food meant to stretch far, offering energy and comfort alike. Cracklin' cornbread muffins were proof that survival could still taste delicious, carrying both resilience and care to the table. Pickled pig's feet. Salad was a dish that startled the tongue but stayed in memory. The gelatinous cuts of pig's feet, slow cooked and cooled, were diced and tossed with onions, peppers, and a sharp vinegar dressing. It was a cold dish, tangy and bright, served in small bowls at Sunday gatherings or alongside biscuits. The flavor was bold, salty, sour, and strong enough to wake the senses. For some, it was a delicacy. For others, a taste they learned to love out of respect for what their elders cherished. It was food with character, no pretending, no disguising what it was. Pickled pig's feet. Salad reminded people that Southern cooking had no waste, no shame, only pride in the craft of using every part of what was given. It was eaten slow, with talk and laughter, a dish meant to be remembered as much as tasted. Cane syrup popcorn balls were a sticky, sweet treat that brought excitement to holidays, school fairs, and church socials. Popcorn was popped fresh and tossed in a hot syrup made from cane syrup, butter, and sometimes a hint of vanilla. While still warm, the mixture was shaped by hand into tight, round balls, the syrup cooling to hold everything together. The rich, earthy sweetness of cane syrup gave the popcorn a flavor far deeper than plain sugar. These treats were often wrapped in wax paper and handed out during special occasions, making them feel like a gift. During the Civil Rights era, cane syrup popcorn balls were a way to make something festive without expensive ingredients. They could be made in large batches, feeding many with just a few pantry staples. For children, they were a highlight of community gatherings, while for adults, they were a reminder of simpler times. The making of them often filled kitchens with laughter, sticky fingers, and the smell of caramelized sugar. Smothered cabbage with sausage ends reflected the practice of never letting a single scrap of meat go to waste. Cabbage was affordable, plentiful, and versatile, often filling the table multiple nights each week. When sausage was cooked, the ends and scraps left behind would be saved and added to cabbage as it simmered down in a pot. The fat and flavor from those bits transformed the humble vegetable into something hearty enough to stand as a full meal. Housewives used this trick to stretch one link of sausage into dinner for an entire household. Families looked forward to it because it combined the freshness of cabbage with the savoriness of meat without requiring much money at all. It became a favorite for cold nights when a hot pan on the stove made the whole house smell warm. Smothered cabbage with sausage ends showed that thrift and flavor could come together, creating a dish that was both practical and deeply satisfying.
Number 17, black-eyed peas and rice. In the South, this was not just New Year's Day luck. This was Wednesday, Thursday, and whatever day came after. Dry black-eyed peas simmered with a ham hock and onion, salt, and pepper until the peas turned creamy and the broth went thick. Served over rice, it became the most complete meal a poor black family could afford. A 1-pound bag cost 15 cents in the 1940s and fed your family for 2 days. The ham hock, often reused across 3 or 4 pots, cost a dime. In the Gullah Geechee communities along the Carolina coast, this dish was called Hoppin' John, and its roots trace back to West African rice and bean dishes carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people. The rice was not incidental. West Africans were specifically enslaved to work Carolina rice plantations because they already knew how to cultivate it. They fed their enslavers with their own knowledge, then fed themselves with the cheapest version of the same grain. That was the cruelty and the genius in one pot. Blackstrap molasses, Johnny cakes combined 2 of the cheapest ingredients into griddle cakes that provided iron, energy, and comfort in every bite. Blackstrap molasses, the darkest byproduct of sugar refining, cost almost nothing because producers considered it waste. Black families knew its value, stirring it into cornmeal batter to create Johnny cakes with deep, almost bitter sweetness that refined sugar could never match. These griddle cakes were fried on cast iron until golden, served hot with more molasses, drizzled on top, or eaten plain as portable breakfast. The iron content helps prevent anemia in children and pregnant women when meat was scarce. This dish represented the alchemy of poverty cooking, transforming industrial byproducts into nourishment that sustained families through hard times. Field pea hash was a hearty skillet meal that turned leftover peas and whatever vegetables remained into breakfast that carried a family through a full day of labor. Black families mashed cooked field peas with diced onions, potatoes, and sometimes leftover meat scraps, then fried the mixture in pork fat until a crispy crust formed on the bottom. The hash was served hot, often topped with a fried egg, creating a complete meal from ingredients that cost almost nothing. Field peas grew abundantly in southern soil, required little care, and dried easily for winter storage, making them a reliable staple in Black gardens. The hash made use of peas cooked days earlier, ensuring nothing spoiled or went to waste. Mothers taught daughters to press the hash firmly against the skillet, creating the crispy bottom that made each serving satisfying. Number 28, salt pork and day-old biscuits. Salt pork was the cheapest cured meat a Black family could afford in the 1920s, and porters bought it in slabs from corner butchers on the south side of Chicago for under 10 cents a pound. Their wives sliced it thin, fried it crisp, and packed it between two halves of a hardened biscuit so the grease soaked in slowly over the next 40 hours. It was a sandwich built to survive a transcontinental run without spoiling. The biscuit had been baked Friday morning, sat on the counter through Saturday, and by Sunday, it was hard enough to crack on the table edge. That hardness was the trick. A fresh biscuit would have crumbled in the pail by the second division stop. Porters ate it, leaning over the polishing bench, careful not to drip on the linen aprons. The biscuit absorbed everything the pork gave off. By the time the porter reached El Paso, the biscuit had become the meal. It was salty, dense, and stretched 2 cents into a full stomach. Smothered cabbage transformed a humble vegetable into something rich through slow cooking with pork fat. The cabbage was shredded and added to a pot with rendered bacon drippings, onions, and a splash of vinegar for brightness. Covered tightly, it cooked low and slow until leaves turned silky and absorbed smoky pork flavor completely. Some families added ham or bacon for extra richness, while others relied solely on drippings. The finished dish was tender and savory, nothing like the crisp vegetable it started as. Cabbage was cheap and stored well through winter, making this a reliable meal when other vegetables were scarce. Children who claimed to hate cabbage ate this version without complaint, won over by richness and depth. Smothered cabbage proved technique mattered more than expensive ingredients. Neck bones and rice became the Christmas Eve supper that sustained Black families through the 1930s, when pork chops and roasts remained far beyond the budget. Neck bones were the cheapest cut at any butcher, bony, tough, and overlooked by those who could afford better. But Black cooks knew these bones held treasure: rich marrow, tender meat tucked between vertebrae, and collagen that transformed cooking liquid into silky gravy. The bones were browned first, then simmered for hours with onions, garlic, and bay leaves until meat fell from the bone at the gentlest touch. Served over rice that soaked up every drop of the savory gravy, a pot of neck bones could feed a large family for almost nothing. Children learned to work around the bones, pulling meat with their fingers and savoring every tender morsel. The dish taught patience. Good things came to those who let the pot simmer, and proved that celebration didn't require prime cuts. Neck bones and rice was honest food that asked for nothing but time and care.
Crackling bread transformed pork scraps into cornbread so rich it could serve as a meal on its own. Cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard from pork fat, were considered waste by some but treasure by Black cooks who understood their value. These crunchy, savory morsels were mixed directly into cornmeal batter, along with buttermilk, salt, and just enough flour to bind everything together. The batter was poured into smoking hot cast iron skillets greased with lard, then baked until the bottom turned dark golden and crispy. Each bite delivered cornmeal's earthy sweetness punctuated by bursts of porky crunch, creating textural contrasts that made plain bread feel special. In Mississippi, Delta communities, and rural Alabama, crackling bread appeared whenever hogs were slaughtered, ensuring every part of the animal fed someone. The bread was substantial enough to be breakfast, lunch, or dinner, often eaten with nothing but a glass of buttermilk or pot liquor from Greens. Children carried wedges of crackling bread in their pockets to school, the fat keeping them full through long days with resourceful hands.
Fried salt pork with red-eye gravy was a breakfast that turned preserved meat and leftover coffee into something surprisingly sophisticated. Thick slices of salt pork were fried in cast iron until crispy at the edges and rendered of their fat, then removed while the pan stayed hot. Strong black coffee was poured into the sizzling drippings, creating a thin, dark gravy that bubbled and concentrated into something intensely savory with bitter undertones. The gravy was spooned over the pork and alongside biscuits or grits, transforming simple ingredients into a meal that satisfied deeply. During wartime, when fresh meat was scarce, salt pork kept without refrigeration and stretched limited ration allowances. The coffee in the gravy wasn't waste. It was clever recycling of yesterday's pot into today's flavor. African American families ate this breakfast before heading to demanding jobs, knowing the salt and fat would fuel them through long hours. Red-eye gravy was working-class ingenuity at its finest.
Stewed okra and tomatoes was one of the most dependable meals when canned goods and garden produce carried families through tight weeks. Mothers sliced fresh okra or thawed frozen pieces, then stirred them into canned tomatoes with onions, pepper, and whatever seasoning was available. The ingredients simmered until everything softened into a thick, flavorful stew that was bright, tangy, and deeply comforting. Served over rice, the dish became hearty enough to count as a full dinner. Children learned to love the soft texture and bold colors, especially when the stew was paired with hot cornbread. It was a meal that proved vegetables could be just as filling and just as important as meat. Many families grew okra in backyard gardens, which made this dish even more accessible, especially in southern homes where neighbors often traded vegetables across fences. The simmering pot offered not just nourishment, but a sense of continuity, reminding everyone that the land and the community still had something to give. Even when times were hardest, a pot of stewed okra and tomatoes represented stability, a meal that could appear again and again without complaint. Stewed okra and tomatoes kept families fed with nothing but patience and a steady simmering pot. Canned tomatoes from summer harvests were one of the most valuable items in any pantry because tomatoes made meals stretch like nothing else. Families canned tomatoes in big batches, crushed, stewed, or whole, using whatever jars they had saved. When winter arrived, those jars became the base for soups, stews, gravies, and rice dishes that needed warmth and tang. The bright red color alone brought life into bleak kitchens. Grandmothers often rationed the jars, saving them for Sundays or meals that had to feed many mouths with very little. Canned tomatoes were not just food. They were security stored in glass, proof that hard work in the summer meant survival in the winter. Every jar opened carried the smell of warm sun and long days spent picking vines clean. Even when money was thin and meals were repetitive, tomatoes made dishes taste full, hearty, and comforting, becoming the quiet hero of countless Depression kitchens. Roasted groundnut soup carried deep ties to African culinary traditions, adapted in America to make use of affordable peanuts. Families would roast groundnuts, grind them into a paste, and simmer them into broth with onions, peppers, or small scraps of meat if available. The result was a rich, nutty soup that was hearty and sustaining, packed with flavor and protein. It was a dish of heritage, showing how African foodways carried strength into new kitchens during segregation. Groundnuts were inexpensive and widely available, making the soup accessible for poor families who needed filling meals. Served with rice or cornbread, it provided comfort and nourishment that stretched across generations. For many, roasted groundnut soup was more than food. It was a connection to identity, history, and resilience. It proved that traditions could survive and adapt even under harsh circumstances. Every spoonful carried thrift and pride, reminding families of both survival and heritage at once. Vinegar pie was born out of scarcity, but baked with the grace of tradition. When lemons were too dear or entirely missing from store shelves, Southern cooks reached for the vinegar jug, whisking a splash into eggs, sugar, and butter to mimic that sharp citrus tang. The mixture baked into a smooth, custard-like filling that shimmered gold under its flaky crust. Its scent filled the kitchen, rich with caramelized sugar and warmth, fooling guests into thinking it was lemon pie until the first bite proved otherwise. Tart and buttery, simple and refined, it was dessert by way of defiance, proving that lack could never defeat imagination. Vinegar pie stood on church supper tables beside fancier dishes and held its own with quiet pride. It was a baker's secret weapon, turning pantry scraps into something elegant enough for company. Every forkful carried a lesson, that sweetness could rise from struggle, and that comfort was never about cost, but creativity. Vinegar pie was more than a dessert. It was a Southern declaration that love and resourcefulness could make even the humblest pie taste like triumph. Field pea salad with onion and vinegar was a chilled dish that made the most of leftover peas from supper. The peas were drained, cooled, and tossed with chopped onions, a splash of vinegar, and a touch of oil or bacon drippings for richness. The result was tangy, refreshing, and hearty enough to be served as a side dish alongside fried chicken, pork chops, or fish. This salad was perfect for hot days, when a stove-heavy meal felt too heavy, providing a cool contrast to the main course. During the Civil Rights era, this was a practical recipe because it used ingredients already on hand and required no extra cooking. Vinegar acted as a preservative, meaning the salad could be made in the morning and kept for later without spoiling. It was common at church picnics and community potlucks, where big bowls of it would sit alongside other homemade dishes. For many, the flavor was tied to summer's peak, when gardens and fields overflowed with fresh peas. Pinto beans with cornbread crumble was one of those meals that showed the full value of stretching simple ingredients as far as they would go. Pinto beans softened after hours of simmering, turning into a creamy pot that needed very little to taste rich. Housewives would season them with onion, garlic, or bits of fat when available, then serve them as the centerpiece of supper. Cornbread, already a staple in many households, was crumbled over the top to soak up the juices and add bulk. This meant a single pot of beans could feed not just one person, but an entire family, with everyone getting full. Children grew up eating it regularly, and fathers relied on its strength before going back to long days of labor. Though it was humble food, it had a kind of quiet dignity, proof that with enough patience, a pot of beans could become survival itself. Pinto beans with cornbread crumble carried households through countless lean nights.
Number 11. Chicken gizzard stew turned an often discarded organ into something families genuinely looked forward to eating. Gizzards were cheap at the butcher counter, sold by the pound for far less than other chicken parts. They required long cooking to become tender, but that time transformed their chewy texture into something almost silky. The gizzards were browned first, then simmered with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and potatoes until everything melded together. Some cooks added carrots or celery, while others kept it simple with salt, pepper, and bay leaves. The gravy that formed was dark and rich, perfect for ladling over rice or biscuits. Children who grew up eating this stew developed a taste for organ meats early. The dish represented kitchen wisdom, knowledge that parts others threw away could become dinner. Poke salad was foraged food that grew wild along fence rows and untended fields, free for the taking when store-bought vegetables were beyond reach. Black families gathered young. pokeweed shoots in early spring, knowing that proper preparation was essential since the mature plant was poisonous. The leaves were boiled in multiple changes of water to remove toxins, then sautéed with onions and bacon grease until tender. This dish required knowledge passed through generations, teaching children which plants to pick, when to harvest, and how to cook them safely. Poke salad represented the connection between Black communities and the land, even when they owned none of it. The bitter greens provided vitamins desperately needed after long winters of preserved foods. Families who knew how to find and cook poke salad never went hungry come spring. Number 16, stewed tomatoes. Over stale bread, tomatoes put up in glass jars during the late summer canning weekend fed Black families through the lean months, and a porter's wife would send a small jar with him for the back end of the run. He poured the cold stewed tomatoes over slices of stale bakery bread saved from the week before, and the bread drank up everything the jar gave off. It was a meal his mother had made during the lean spring of 1919, and her mother had made it in the years right after emancipation. The tomatoes were sweet and slightly acid. The bread turned soft enough to eat with a spoon. Porters ate it sitting on the porter's bench, the tin pail open at their feet, the run behind them, and another one already on the schedule for Friday morning. Pot liquor soup turned the cooking water from greens into a meal, stretching vegetables further than seemed possible. When collards were simmered for hours with smoked meat, the liquid became rich with vitamins and savory flavor. Rather than discard this broth, families added leftover cornbread, crumbled into bowls, where it softened into something between soup and porridge. Some versions included potatoes or beans, while others relied solely on the liquid and bread. Pot liquor provided nutrients that might otherwise be lost, especially valued during lean winter months. Mothers served it to sick children as healing tonic. The soup required almost no additional ingredients, just wisdom to recognize value where others saw waste. Pot liquor embodied using everything and wasting nothing. Fried rabbit appeared on 1930s Black Christmas tables as a protein that cost nothing but time, skill, and the knowledge of where to find them. Boys learned to set snares and check trap lines in the weeks before Christmas, bringing home rabbits that would become the centerpiece of holiday dinner. The rabbits were cleaned, soaked in salt water to draw out blood, then cut into pieces and soaked again in buttermilk to tenderize the lean meat. Dredged in seasoned flour and fried slowly in lard until golden brown and crackling crisp, fried rabbit rivaled chicken in flavor while costing not a single penny. The meat was firm but tender, with a slightly sweet, mild taste that children loved. Families who lived near woods or fields could count on rabbit when nothing else was certain, making it a reliable Christmas tradition during uncertain times. Fried rabbit represented self-sufficiency, the ability to feed your family through skill rather than money, and the dignity of providing something special through your own effort.
Fried green tomatoes were a porch-side favorite, a snack for hot days and easy laughter. Slices of firm green tomatoes were dipped in cornmeal, fried golden in a skillet, and sprinkled with salt while still sizzling. The result was crisp on the outside, soft inside, and just tart enough to make your mouth water. You could eat them standing up, still hot from the pan, or stack them high beside a plate of beans and rice. They were the kind of treat you didn't plan, you just made them when the garden gave too many tomatoes. The pop of oil, the hum of conversation, and the smell of cornmeal frying turned an ordinary afternoon into something special. Kids waited by the stove, stealing pieces when the cook wasn't looking, their fingers burned but happy. Fried green tomatoes weren't just about taste, they were about time, patience, and community. Their taste was bold but humble. a reminder of summers that felt endless and simple pleasures that cost almost nothing. Fried green tomatoes were living proof that good things come to those who cook from the heart.
Sweet potato pone was a dense, spiced dessert that satisfied sweet cravings when refined sugar was rationed and store-bought treats were unaffordable. Grated sweet potatoes were mixed with molasses, eggs, butter, and warming spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and ginger, then baked until set and caramelized at the edges. The result was something between pudding and cake, moist, intensely sweet from the potatoes themselves, and deeply comforting. African American families served it warm, sometimes with a splash of cream or buttermilk poured over the top. Sweet potatoes grew abundantly in southern gardens, making this dessert accessible even when money was scarce. The dish connected families to African foodways, where root vegetables had long been transformed into sweets. Children begged for second helpings, scraping every bit of caramelized edge from the pan. Sweet potato pone proved that dessert didn't require expensive ingredients, just creativity, patience, and produce from the garden.
Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the meal that proved nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. After cooking meat, mothers saved the browned bits and leftover grease from the bottom of the skillet. With a bit of flour, water, and patient stirring, those drippings transformed into a smooth, savory gravy that tasted like far more than it cost. Poured over fresh rice, the gravy turned a plain bowl into a full dinner that kept children satisfied for hours. The smell of the gravy thickening was enough to bring everyone to the table early. Some nights, mothers added onions or a pinch of seasoning if they had it, deepening the flavor even more. Other nights, it was nothing but drippings and water, yet still tasted like comfort. Children learned early that gravy night meant nobody would go hungry. It was simple, filling, and reliable, the kind of meal that made hard days feel a little easier. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the quiet hero of many 1960s kitchens. Collard green bunches for drying were common because greens grew well, fed many mouths, and could be preserved long after harvest. Families tied them in bundles, hung them in kitchens or porches, and let them dry slowly in the air. These dried leaves were later simmered with whatever seasoning was available, turning into tender, flavorful greens even in the dead of winter when fresh produce was out of reach. Sometimes a scrap of fatback went into the pot, but even when it did not, the greens still tasted like comfort. Every dried bunch felt like a piece of summer tucked away for later. This practice connected generations. Children watched elders hang the bunches, learning quietly how to prepare for the months ahead. It was survival, but also tradition, rooted in memory, skill, and a deep understanding of how to make the land stretch. Fried rabbit livers were a dish that demonstrated the principle of using every possible part of small game. Rabbits were often hunted as a source of food when store-bought meat was too expensive, and nothing from them was wasted. The livers, cleaned and seasoned, were dredged in flour or cornmeal and fried until crisp on the outside and tender within. They were eaten hot from the pan or served with bread, offering quick protein at little cost. This dish was not luxurious, but it represented practicality and the resourcefulness required for survival. For African American families, especially in rural areas, fried rabbit livers tied directly to the skill of providing for one's household through both hunting and cooking. Children grew up learning that no part of the animal could be ignored. Fried rabbit livers carried both thrift and tradition, proving that resilience often meant finding value in what others would discard. They were survival food, deeply tied to ingenuity and endurance. Homemade syrup bread was born in kitchens where sugar, eggs, and butter had all run dry. Cooks would mix coarse flour with syrup water, baking it slow until it came out dark, sticky, and fragrant. The crust turned crisp while the inside stayed tender, sweetened not by plenty but by invention. It was a bread that tasted of molasses and hard work, the kind that made plain coffee taste richer. Every slice was heavy in the hand, soft in the mouth, and filled with the scent of survival. Families tore it apart with their fingers, letting the syrup glaze stick to their skin. It was eaten for breakfast or supper, depending on what the day offered, and always left you wanting one more bite. Homemade syrup bread taught cooks that sweetness did not come from sugar, but from persistence. It was a reminder that warmth could rise from even the barest pantry. When times were hardest, this bread made people feel human again, loved, fed, and home.
Number 20, crackling bread was breakfast that used every bit of the hog, including the crispy bits left after rendering lard. Cracklings, those crunchy pieces of fried pork skin and fat, were folded into cornbread batter before baking. The result was cornbread studded with pockets of salty, chewy richness that made plain bread into something special. Children searched for the crackling pieces in their slices, savoring each bite of crispy pork among the cornmeal. This bread required nothing extra on top because the fat was already baked inside. Families who raised their own hogs had cracklings available after butchering, and nothing was ever wasted. The bread came from the oven fragrant and golden. This was poverty food that tasted like abundance, turning scraps into something worth anticipating. Crackling bread carried heritage in every bite. Pot liquor with cornbread was the liquid gold that nourished Black families when nothing else remained in the pantry. After collard greens or turnip greens simmered for hours with salt pork, the cooking liquid transformed into a nutrient-rich broth that families refused to waste. This greenish-brown liquid held vitamins and the essence of everything cooked in it, far more valuable than water alone. Families ladled warm pot liquor into bowls and crumbled day-old cornbread directly into the liquid, creating a filling meal from what others poured down the drain. Children grew up sipping pot liquor as medicine and comfort, knowing this humble broth represented their family's ability to stretch every ingredient. The tradition passed through generations, each understanding that throwing away pot liquor meant throwing away sustenance itself. Number 24, chitlins cleaned the night before a run. Chitlins were the cheapest pork a Black household could buy in 1929, sold for almost nothing because white grocers considered them scrap. Porters' wives cleaned them at the kitchen sink the night before a run, boiling them with onion and red pepper until the smell drove the children out onto the back porch. The cooked chitlins were then packed cold in a small jar and wedged beside the cornbread in the tin pail. Porters ate them at the end of the second shift when the dining car was shut and the sleeper berths were quiet. A man from Mobile said his mother used to cook them with vinegar to cut the funk, and that was the version he carried north with him to Chicago. The meal was old country food riding on a brand new luxury train. The contradiction never bothered the men who ate it. Buttermilk cornbread was the daily bread of Black households, baked fresh in cast iron skillets that gave it a distinctive crust. The buttermilk's tang balanced cornmeal's natural sweetness, creating bread neither too heavy nor too light. Women heated lard in the skillet until it smoked, then poured in batter which sizzled and began crisping immediately. The bread baked until golden on top, while the bottom formed a crunchy shell. Buttermilk was often the only dairy families had, obtained cheaply as byproduct of butter making. The cornbread was eaten warm with greens, beans, or crumbled into cold buttermilk for a quick meal. Every cook had her particular ratio passed down without measurements. Buttermilk cornbread was comfort itself, the smell of it baking signaling home. Squirrel stew provided Christmas dinner protein for 1930s Black families living near woods where small game remained free for those skilled enough to hunt it. Boys and men would spend December mornings in the cold, rifles or snares ready, bringing home squirrels that would become the centerpiece of holiday feasting. The squirrels were cleaned and jointed, then browned in bacon grease before being covered with water, onions, and root vegetables from the cellar. The stew simmered for hours until the meat fell tender from small bones and the broth turned rich with flavor. Served over rice or with cornbread for dipping, one pot of squirrel stew could feed an entire extended family. The dish required skill, hunting, cleaning, and cooking, but no money beyond the cost of ammunition. Squirrel stew represented independence and self-reliance, the ability to provide Christmas dinner through knowledge rather than wealth. The meat was sweet and mild, a gift from the forest that appeared on tables across the rural South.
Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment.
Peanut soup carried African roots directly into American kitchens, connecting 1940s families to culinary traditions that survived the Middle Passage. Ground peanuts were simmered with water or broth, onions, and whatever vegetables the garden provided, creating a creamy, protein-rich soup costing almost nothing. Peanuts grew easily in southern soil, and many African-American families cultivated them in home gardens, providing reliable protein when meat was rationed. The soup was thick enough to satisfy hunger, yet simple enough for everyday cooking, often served with rice or cornbread. George Washington Carver had championed peanuts as a crop for black farmers, and dishes like this demonstrated his advocacy's wisdom. The flavor was earthy and rich, warming bodies and spirits on cold evenings when other comforts were scarce. Children preferred it to other vegetable soups because of its natural sweetness and creamy texture. Peanut soup represented cultural memory and practical survival combined.
Butter beans with turkey tails were a staple because turkey tails were inexpensive but full of flavor and fat. Mothers simmered the tails slowly, letting their rich, smoky taste seep into the pot. Butter beans softened as they cooked, becoming creamy and thick while absorbing every bit of seasoning. The dish warmed the house as it simmered, filling the air with a savory scent that promised a satisfying dinner. Children scooped generous spoonfuls over rice or ate them with cornbread, grateful for each hearty bite. The meal stretched easily across days and reheated beautifully. Many families saved the leftover broth to season another dish later in the week, wasting nothing. Turkey tails might have been overlooked by others, but in these kitchens, they were treated with skill, patience, and respect. Mothers understood that the key to survival was knowing how to extract every ounce of flavor from inexpensive ingredients. Butter beans with turkey tails were a quiet triumph of frugality and skill. Homemade sorghum candy was a sweet born from thrift, providing children with joy when store-bought confections were out of reach. Families would boil sorghum syrup until it thickened into a sticky mixture, then pour it into molds or spread it to cool into hard candy. The result was simple yet satisfying, offering a burst of sweetness without the expense of refined sugar. For children living through segregation, these candies became cherished treats, reminders that even in scarcity, small luxuries could exist. Sorghum was widely grown and affordable, making it an accessible ingredient for poor families. Adults valued the practicality, while children treasured the taste. It was food that showed how ingenuity could stretch limited resources into moments of happiness. Homemade sorghum candy was not just a snack, but a piece of memory, carrying both culture and care. In kitchens where survival dominated, it was a symbol that joy was still possible. Collard green sandwiches were the working person's lunch, built for long days and calloused hands. Cold collard greens, left over from the night before, were pressed between thick slabs of cornbread still warm from the skillet. Sometimes there was bacon grease brushed inside for flavor, sometimes just salt and love. It was food meant to travel, sturdy, filling, and easy to eat between shifts or in the shade of a field. Every bite was smoky, tangy, and satisfying, a little taste of home wrapped in practicality. You did not need silverware or a plate, only the will to keep going. These sandwiches held the spirit of the South's hardest workers, people who made do with what they had and still made it taste like something fine. The greens gave strength, the bread gave comfort, and together they carried families through hard seasons. Collard green sandwiches were humble, yes, but they fed both body and pride. They proved that even leftovers could tell a story of perseverance and belonging.
Number 30, cold cornbread wrapped in wax paper. Every porter's run began with a square of yesterday's cornbread tucked against the lining of the tin pail. It was the cheapest food a black household in Chicago or Atlanta could send a working man out the door with, and it was the most reliable. Wives baked it in cast iron the night before, cut it into bricks, and wrapped each piece in wax paper so the crumbs stayed off the starched jacket. By 1928, a porter on the Panama Limited could go 16 hours between proper meals, and the cornbread was what kept him standing through the second shift. He ate it dry, leaning against the vestibule door, sometimes with a sliver of cured pork pressed inside like a pocket. Nothing about it was special. That was the whole point. The last dish on this list is not the rarest or the oldest. It is the one that never left. The pot that stayed on the stove when the lights got cut off and the rent was 3 weeks late. Cook one of these this week. Not from a video, from your own memory. If your family made something on this list, name it in the comments. And if you know a dish that belongs here but did not make it, drop that one too. That corner store run your auntie used to make fed more people than any restaurant in town ever did.